30 years at the forge, 4 years of Japanese blacksmithing, 200 books on metallurgy, and all of it is now locked away inside the body of a penniless, rank 0 apprentice who has been given 7 days before being evicted onto the street. Dan opens his eyes on the icy stone floor. His cheek is pressed against something rough and lifeless. It smells of coal dust and dampness. In front of him is a cooled-down forge. He raises his hand and freezes. The hand is not his own. Young, calloused, not his. Dan sits up and scans the walls. Stone, a low ceiling, dim light from a narrow window. A smithy, old and abandoned. A hammer with a crooked handle lies on the workbench. A scroll with unfamiliar runes hangs above it, and nearby, someone has pinned a crumpled piece of paper to the wood with a knife. Dan grabs the workbench and pulls himself closer. The letters are foreign, but for some reason he understands them. Daniel's property. Level 0 apprentice.
Subject to eviction in 7 days for non-payment of guild dues. He reads it 3 times. Looks at the stranger's hands, at the horn, back at the hands. He doesn't know where he is. Doesn't know when. Doesn't know how. But the smell of coal is real. The hammer is real. 800 grams. The balance is off, but it's a hammer. Dan takes it, and his fingers fall onto the handle of their own accord. His body remembers. Not his memory, someone else's. Hammered in over the years. He turns the hammer, grips it, weighs it. A poor tool, but a working one. Fine. Dream or not, he'll be forging. He actually has a knife from Mrs. Kowalski that's unfinished. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan climbs into the coal pit. The coal is lousy, damp, with impurities. He picks out the cleaner pieces, finds a tinderbox, flint and steel, strikes a spark, a second, a third. The tinder catches on the 4th try. He fans the flame and feeds coal into the bellows. His hands work on their own.
This foreign body knows the movements, but doesn't know why. Dan knows why. He always knows why. The forge heats up slowly. The draft is weak. Dan finds some old bellows by the wall. The leather is cracked but still holds air. He pumps. Once, twice, 3 times. The coals turn red, then yellow. And then there's a knock at the door. Loud, demanding. Dan wipes his hands and throws the door open. On the threshold stands a short, fat man in a green doublet with a leather bag. He looks up at Dan and demands the monthly payment. 3 silver marks. The deadline passed 2 days ago. Dan asks how much time he has. The man explains that according to the guild's bylaws, non-payment within 7 days leads to revocation of the license and eviction. Dan asks how much 3 marks is in terms of something he can understand. The man looks at him strangely and replies, 3 marks is 1 decent knife at the market, or 12 horseshoes, or 6 days' work for a laborer. Dan nods. Got it.
He asks if he can pay with goods. The man snorts. The guild only accepts coins. But if Daniel manages to sell something at the market in Glimmerholm, that's his business. Only, it's unlikely anyone would buy a 0-level item. Even 0-level horseshoes are only taken out of pity. The man leaves. Dan leans his back against the door. Level 0. For the 2nd time. He approaches the scroll with runes. The letters become visible if you look slightly from the side.
It's a ranking system. Level 0, apprentice, horseshoes and nails. Level 1, junior blacksmith, and so on up to 10, grand master, blades that cleave mountains. The level is determined by the guild stone. You touch it and it reveals the potential of your soul. Dan looks at the hands that aren't his own, the potential of the soul. Of course. He doesn't know whose soul is in this body right now. His own? Someone else's? A third's? But he knows one thing.
Dan sits down on the cold floor and does what he always does when life rears up. He counts. The forge is working. The coal is burning. 3 hammers. The anvil has a crack, but holds. The iron is shoddy, but there is some. The hands are someone else's, but they know how to forge. And in his head, 30 years at the forge, and precise knowledge of what carbon does to iron at 723 degrees. Dan picks up a scrap of metal from the floor. He bends it. The iron folds like putty. He curses. This isn't steel. It's raw iron. You can forge horseshoes out of this, nails, a bolt, but not a blade. Never a blade. And yet, Dan picks up the red-hot bar with tongs and places it on the anvil. The first blow is a test. The metal responds with a dull thud. Soft. He strikes again. And again. He listens to the sound. He always listens to the sound. That's the first thing his father taught him. Don't look at the color. Listen. Metal speaks if you know how to hear it. An hour later, the strip of iron has turned into a rough blank. Dan sets it aside to cool and runs his finger over the surface. A habit. He always did that at home. He'd mumble something over the cooling metal. "Come on, kid, don't let me down." He says that now, too, in a whisper, and the piece of metal grows warm. Dan pulls his hand away. The iron was cooling. He could tell by the color, and suddenly, warmth. Not from the forge, not from residual heat, from within, as if the iron had answered. The workpiece lies there, silent, just an ordinary piece of metal. But Dan has been a blacksmith for 30 years. He knows how cooling iron behaves. And what just happened doesn't fit into any textbook. And in 5 days at the Glimmerholm market, someone will buy his knife. Because Dan Hollis will make a decent blade out of, even from this shameful raw iron, even with crooked hammers, even on a cracked anvil. He returns to the forge and gets to work. Dan hadn't slept all night. Not because he was afraid, because he was working. The bellows hummed steadily. The bellows swung in a 3-second rhythm. Dan took 4 pieces of the purest iron he could find in the smithy's stock and started with something simple. A knife. A kitchen knife. The most ordinary kind. The kind he'd made at home hundreds of times. The problem was the material. Iron without enough carbon isn't steel. It's a soft, malleable mass that won't hold an edge. At home, Dan would have just grabbed a strip of 1095 or at least an old file. Here, he had nothing but this raw material and his own brain. But in his head were 30 years, and the first thing that came to mind was the word mentation, an ancient method, older than any modern metallurgy. You take iron, you surround it with coal in a closed crucible. You heat it for a long time. Carbon penetrates the surface and turns the soft iron into something resembling steel. Rough, uneven, but it works. Dan found a cracked clay pot in the corner of the smithy. He patched the crack with clay from the floor. He placed 2 pieces of iron in the pot, He covered them with crushed coal. He sealed the lid with clay. He set it in the furnace. And he waited. Cementation takes hours, sometimes a day. Dan used this time to explore the surroundings. The smithy stood on the edge of the village of Glimmerholm. The village was small, 24 houses, a tavern with a crooked sign, a well in the square, a mill on the hill, and a smithy. His smithy, or rather, the smithy of that Daniel whose body he now inhabited. The villagers watched him from a distance. No one approached. An old woman by the well spat as he walked past. A boy of about 10 threw a pebble at him and ran away. Dan wasn't offended. He understood. The former Daniel wasn't held in high regard here. Level 0. A loser. A debtor. Someone they tolerated out of pity until the guild evicted him. Dan walked into the tavern.
Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark hair tied in a bun. Her hands were calloused. Red. Calluses not from a sword, but from rags and wooden spoons. She looked at him blankly and asked what he wanted. Dan said he wanted to know how much a kitchen knife cost at the market. The woman raised an eyebrow. She replied that a decent knife made by a second-level craftsman cost 2 marks. A 0-level knife was worth nothing. Dan asked what if a 0-level knife cut better than a second-level one. The woman replied that such a thing was impossible. Dan nodded and left. He returned to the smithy and checked the pot. The clay was holding. The temperature was right. Another 6 hours. He sat down by the furnace and began to think. He needed to understand the system, not just to survive, but to understand how this world works, what these levels are, what the guild is, why his iron is so bad, and most importantly, what happened to the metal when he touched it.
Dan stood up and walked over to the workbench. He picked up yesterday's workpiece. That very one. The one that had warmed up. He placed it on the anvil, ran his finger over it. Nothing. Cold iron. He tried again, more slowly. Nothing. Dan closed his eyes. He remembered how it had been yesterday. He was forging. He got tired. He ran his finger over it out of habit and said, "Come on, kid. Don't let me down." He said it now, out loud. Silence. His fingers lay on the cold metal. 1 second, 2, 3. Warmth. Faint, as if someone had lit a match beneath the surface. Dan didn't move his hand. He kept his finger on the metal and felt the warmth grow. Then it was gone, just as suddenly as it had appeared. He opened his eyes and looked at the workpiece. Nothing had changed on the outside, but Dan knew something had happened. He didn't understand what, but his hands felt it as clearly as the difference between raw iron and hardened steel.
8 hours later, he pulled the pot out of the kiln. He broke the clay. He took out 2 pieces of iron. They had changed. The surface had darkened. It had become denser. Dan picked up 1 piece with tongs and struck it with a hammer. The sound was different, higher, ringier, not the dull groan of raw iron, but something like a voice. Carburization had worked. Carbon had penetrated the upper layers, not deep, maybe 0.5 millimeter, but that would be enough. Dan placed both pieces on top of each other and began to forge them. Welding in the furnace, another ancient method. Heat until white hot. Strike. 2 pieces become 1. Then fold. Forge again. Each fold doubles the number of layers.
It was the prototype of what the Japanese did with tamahagane, folding, forging, folding, forging. 200 layers, 400. Dan didn't count. He listened to the metal. When the sound became even and clear, he stopped. The blank was small, the size of a palm, but it was different.
It was no longer a raw blank. It was steel. Rough, uneven, with places where the carbon had settled thicker and places where it was thinner. But steel. Dan forged all the next day. He stretched the blank into a strip. He shaped the bevels. He marked the tang. Then came the moment of hardening. At home, he would have used canola oil. Here, he had a barrel of murky water. Water is bad. Water cools too quickly. Cracks, deformation. But Dan knew a trick. He heated the blade until it turned cherry red. He scooped up a handful of clay from the floor and smeared it over the tang. A thick layer. He left the cutting edge bare. Differential hardening. The edge cools quickly. It becomes hard. The tang under the clay cools slowly. It remains ductile. The result? A knife that cuts and doesn't break. He dipped the blade into the water. Steam shot up toward the ceiling. The water hissed. Dan held it and counted the seconds. Then he pulled it out. He wiped it. He looked. The blade was dark. A thin, wavy line ran along the edge of the clay. Hamen. That's what it was called in the Japanese tradition. The boundary between hard and soft. Between the life and death of metal. Dan smiled, for the first time in 2 days. Then he took a scrap of deer antler he'd found in a pile of trash behind the smithy. He shaped it, drilled a hole with an old awl, fitted it onto the tang. He wedged it in. The handle fit his hand like a glove. He sharpened the blade on a stone from the stream. For a long time, methodically, he tested it on a hair from his arm. The hair fell. Dan looked at the finished knife. A kitchen knife. Simple, with a horn handle and a wavy Hamen line along the blade. No zero-level blacksmith in Ferranos would have made one like this. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was a knock at the smithy door. Quiet, hesitant. Dan opened it. A girl of about 12 stood in the doorway. Her eyes were red from crying. Her dress was dirty. Her hands were shaking. She said her name was Lyra, that her mom was very sick, that the doctor said she needed surgery, but the local knives were too rough. The surgeon refused. He said he'd only kill her with such a tool. The girl began to cry. She said her father had been a blacksmith. He used to live next door. He died a year ago, and she didn't know where to go. Dan was silent. He looked at this girl in a foreign world and saw before him Mrs. Kowalski's daughter, who would come to the workshop every time and say, "Mr. Hollis, can you really make a knife that cuts by itself?" And he would answer every time, "No, Susie, a knife doesn't cut by itself." "But if I make it right, your mom won't have to push." Dan crouched down in front of the girl. He took her little hand, small, cold, wet with tears. He asked what her mom's name was. Lyra answered, "Mabel." He asked what her mom liked to do. Lyra said her mom liked to sing, in the morning when she's kneading dough, and when she's hanging up the laundry,
And when she thinks no one can hear her. Dan nodded. He asked what her mom was like. Lyra stopped crying and thought for a moment. She said her mom was warm, that her hands smelled like flour, that she always knew when Lyra was lying, and that she had promised
never to leave. Dan stood up. He told the girl to go home and be with her mom and to come back again tomorrow morning. Lara left. Dan closed the door. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked over to the forge and began to work. Dan forged all night. He remelted a horseshoe, an old one, a rusty one. He'd found it behind the smithy under a pile of junk. The horseshoe was made of slightly better iron than the rest of his stock. Someone had once made it with care. Dan could feel it when he picked it up. The metal was denser, smoother. Maybe that blacksmith neighbor, Lara's father. Maybe he forged horseshoes just as Dan forged knives for Mrs. Kowalski, with respect for the craft.
Dan chopped the horseshoe into 3 pieces with a chisel. He set one aside. He threw 2 into the forge. Then he pulled a nail out of his boot. The boot wasn't his, it belonged to the former Daniel, but the nail was steel. Real steel. Dan had no idea where in this world a steel nail had come from in an apprentice's boot, but he recognized the steel by touch. High carbon, hard, the kind used for cutting tools. 1 small nail, 2 centimeters long. That would be enough. Dan flattened the nail and forged it into the core of the horseshoe blank. Steel on the inside, iron on the outside. A soft shell protects a hard core. That's the principle of the katana. Sanmai. 3 layers. Dan hammered the blank and thought of a woman named Mabel. He didn't know her, had never seen her, but Lyra had told him enough. Warm, smells of flower, sings when she thinks she's alone. She knows when her daughter is lying. Dan struck with the hammer, putting the same thing into every blow. Live. The strip grew thinner, more elegant. Dan was shaping the blade of a scalpel. Not a knife, not a sword. A surgical scalpel, thin as a leaf, as narrow as a needle, with a curve along the back for precise control. He made ones like that at home, just once, for a surgeon from Philadelphia who came into the workshop and said, "I need a scalpel that feels the tissue." Dan laughed then. A scalpel doesn't feel. The hand feels. But he made it, and the surgeon called every month afterward and said that with this scalpel he could do things he couldn't with others. Dan didn't believe in mysticism. He believed in the geometry of the edge. But now, in this world where iron grows warm from a whisper, he decided to try. He forged and spoke to the metal, quietly, in English that no one here understood. He said, "Listen, you are about to become something important. You were made from a horseshoe and a nail, from what carried horses and held boots. You know what it means to carry and to hold. Now you will need to find and cut. There is a woman. Her name is Mabel. She is warm and sings in the mornings. There is something in her that shouldn't be there. You need to find it and remove it, carefully, so that she can sing again later." The hammer came down. The metal rang out. Dan didn't know if the iron could hear him, but he knew he could hear himself, and that was more important. By dawn, the scalpel was ready. Dan tempered it in water mixed with ash. Then he sharpened it. For a long time, 2 hours on a stone from the stream, he honed the edge until the blade could cut through wet silk without moving it. He tested it on a thread. The thread snapped at the touch. He made the handle from a scrap of deer antler, thin, fitting the surgeon's small hand.
He wrapped it with a strip of leather for a secure grip. Then he sat down and looked at the finished instrument. Small, fragile-looking, a blade the length of a finger, the curve barely noticeable, a hamon like a thin thread.
And if you looked at it from a certain angle, a pattern emerged on the surface of the steel. Folds from the forging, like waves, or as if someone were singing. Dan wrapped the scalpel in a clean cloth and waited. Lyra arrived at dawn. Her eyes were still red but no longer wet. She was silent and looked at Dan. He handed her the bundle and told her to take it to the surgeon and to pass on one thing from him. The scalpel would find where to cut on its own. Lyra pressed the bundle to her chest and ran off. Dan sat down by the furnace. He was empty, exhausted. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, but from something else, as if he had given up something along with that scalpel, a part of himself. He fell asleep right on the smithy floor, face down in the cooled ashes, just like on the first day. He slept for a full day, a whole day. When he woke up, it was evening the next day outside the window, the fourth day. 3 days left until eviction. He stood up. His head was spinning. His arms were weak. Dan walked over to the barrel and splashed water on his face.
Cold. Sobering. He drank 3 handfuls. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. Glimmerholm lay in the evening twilight, quiet, peaceful. Smoke and the smell of roasted meat wafted from the tavern. Dan walked down the street. He didn't know why. His legs carried him of their own accord. He stopped near Lyra's house. The door was open. A candle was burning inside. Dan didn't go in. He stood there and listened. Silence. Then a voice, a woman's, soft, humming something, a simple melody, no words. Dan stood there listening, and his throat tightened. Mabel was singing. The surgeon had done his job. The scalpel had found where to cut. A woman named Mabel, who loves to sing in the mornings, will live. Dan returned to the blacksmith shop. He closed the door, sat down on the floor, and sat there for a long time in the dark. He didn't cry. He never cried. But something inside him shifted.
Like a tectonic plate, slowly and irreversibly. At home, his knives were merchandise. Good merchandise. High quality. He was proud of them. But they were merchandise. Here, his scalpel had just saved a life. Not because it was made of good steel, but because he had made it for Mabel. For a specific woman with a specific name and a specific daughter. And the metal remembered that. Dan didn't understand how. He didn't understand the mechanism. He didn't know if it was magic or physics or something else, but he knew it had happened. And it changed everything. On the morning of the 5th day, he had to solve a problem with 3 marks. He looked at the kitchen knife he'd made 2 days earlier, a good knife, with a hamon, with a horn handle, a knife worth 2 marks if made by a 2nd-level craftsman, and 0 if made by a 0-level one. Dan took the knife and went to the market. The market in Glimmerholm was small, a dozen stalls in the square, greens, meat, fabrics, pots, and one stall with knives and tools. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a short beard and a leather apron, a 2nd-level master. His name was Gregor.
Dan walked up and placed the knife on the counter. Gregor looked at it. Then he picked it up, turned it over, checked the balance, looked at the edge, then at the ham, then at Dan. He asked who had made it. Dan said he had. Gregor replied that it was impossible, because he'd known Daniel since childhood. Daniel couldn't even forge a straight nail, and this was at least third-level work. Dan shrugged and said he'd learned. Gregor was silent for a long time. Then he ran his finger along the blade. He cut himself. He looked at the blood on his finger. He looked at the knife. He looked at Dan. He said he'd give 2 marks. Dan said he needed 3. Gregor said 2 was a fair price, because the knife didn't have the guild's mark, and 0 level is 0 level, no matter how good the knife was. Dan nodded. 2 marks. 1 short.
He went back to the forge and started thinking.
1 mark in 2 days. He looked at his supplies. He was running out of iron. Coal, too. Enough for 1 knife, maybe 1.5. Dan stoked the forge again. 6 hours later, he had a second knife. Simpler than the first, no hilt, but sharp and with good geometry. He took it to Gregor. Gregor gave him a mark. Reluctantly. He said he wouldn't buy any more because he'd have nothing left to sell if some nobody was making better knives than him. Dan didn't argue. 3 marks. Exactly what he needed. On the 6th day, the tax collector came. The same short, fat man in a green doublet. Dan placed 3 silver marks on the workbench. The man counted them. He nodded. He took a seal out of his bag and stamped the paper with it. Paid. Next payment in a month. Dan asked if he wanted to raise his level.
The man looked at him as if he were a fool and replied that to do so, he would need to undergo an assessment at the Guildstone at the nearest guild branch. It's in the city of Crosshaven, 2 days' walk to the west, but there's no point in a 0 level going there. The stone shows the potential of the soul, not the skill of the hands. If your soul is 0, you could forge for 100 years. You'd still be 0. The man left. Dan stood at the workbench and thought. Soul potential, not manual skill. So the system here isn't about skill. It's about something else. Some kind of inner quality that the artifact reads, and the former Daniel didn't have that quality. But he did. Dan Hollis from Allentown, who had just forged a scalpel and saved a life. Did he have it or not? He didn't know. And the only way to find out was in Crosshaven. But 2 days on foot meant 4 days there and back, 4 days without work, 4 days without pay. Especially since he needed 3 more marks in a month and he was out of iron. No, not now. Work first. Dan left the smithy and headed for the tavern. He pushed the door open and went inside. Inside, it was warm and empty. Morning hour. The same woman behind the counter, dark hair, worked hands. She looked at him and said that if he'd come to ask about knife prices, she'd already told him everything. Dan replied that no, he hadn't. He'd come with an offer. He could fix any kitchen tool for her for free, in exchange for food, once a day. The woman smiled. Then she looked at him more closely. Then she said her name was Anna Beckett, and that she did indeed have 3 knives that no longer cut, and 2 cast-iron pots with cracks. Dan said he would fix the pots by evening.
He would sharpen the knives in an hour. Anna nodded and set a plate of porridge with a piece of bread in front of him. Dan ate it all in a minute. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Anna watched him eat and said nothing.
But when he finished, she set a second plate in front of him, also in silence. Dan repaired the pots by lunchtime. He welded the cracks in the pot, roughly but reliably. He sharpened the knives in an hour and a half. 3 knives. All of them were blunt as hell. Dan sharpened them on a whetstone and thought about who had made them. Second tier, maybe third. But the geometry was off. The sharpening angle was too wide. The bevels were uneven. The balance was shifted toward the handle. These knives were made from a template, without understanding, without considering who would use them. Dan reground the angles. He smoothed out the edges. He reforged one knife slightly. He shortened the blade and shifted the center of gravity closer to the tip. For slicing. Judging by the wear, this knife is used most often for slicing. That means control is needed at the tip, not at the heel. In the evening, he took the knives and mess kits to the tavern. Anna picked up a knife. She tried to slice an onion. She froze. She tried again. The onion fell apart into thin, translucent rings. Anna looked up at Dan. She didn't say anything, but Dan knew the look on her face. He'd seen it hundreds of times, with customers in the workshop. When a person first picks up a knife made just right, not a fancy one, not an expensive one, just right, for his hand, for his movement. Anna said he could come eat 3 times a day. Dan said twice would be enough. Anna replied that 3 was final and non-negotiable. Dan didn't argue. The next day, the first real customer arrived. An old soldier named Torvald. Lame. His face was scarred. He leaned on the cane and was breathing heavily. Torvald sat down on a bench by the smithy and was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd heard from a surgeon about a scalpel. The surgeon said the instrument finds the right place to cut on its own. Torvald doesn't know if that's true or not, but he has a need. His right leg doesn't work. His knee was shattered 20 years ago by an orc's mace. The bone healed crooked. He walks with a cane. The cane breaks every 2 months. Torvald asked if Dan could make a cane that wouldn't break. Dan looked at his cane. Wood. Walnut. Sturdy but thick. Overloaded. Torvald compensates for his bad leg by leaning his full weight on it. The cane can't take it. Dan asked if he could watch him walk. Torvald stood up and took 10 steps. Back. 10 more. Dan watched. Not at the leg, at the body. At how Torvald shifted his weight. At how he leaned. At where the cane touched the ground. Then he asked about the war. Torvald frowned. Dan said he wasn't asking out of curiosity. He needed to know how Torvald moved when he was healthy. Torvald paused and answered. He was a spearman, right flank, 22 years in the ranks, 3 wars, 4 wounds. He was used to standing straight and holding the line. Dan nodded. A spearman. So his center of gravity must be low. Stability. And his hand was used to the shaft. Long, thin, balanced in the lower third. He told Torvald to come back in 3 days. Torvald asked how much it would cost. Dan said he'd decide when he was done. Torvald left. Dan stood at the workbench and thought. He had no iron, no steel. There was one remaining piece of a horseshoe. That wouldn't be enough for a cane. He needed material. He left the smithy and walked through the village, looking for metal. Any metal.
Rusty hinges, broken locks, old tools. In 2 hours, he gathered a handful of scrap metal, 3 hinges, a fragment of a sickle, 2 nails, and a piece of chain from a well that someone had thrown away because the links were rusted through. Dan returned to the smithy and sorted through his haul. The chain was made of the best iron, maybe even with a hint of steel. The sickle was usable too. The nails would go into the core. He got to work, carburizing again, folding again, forging again. But this time he wasn't making a blade.
He was making a rod. Thin, long, strong. A rod that would become the core of a staff. And around it, Dan wrapped strips of iron, like tendons around a bone. He forged and twisted, forged and twisted. Torsion. This technique made Viking blades both flexible and strong at the same time. The twisted metal fibers worked like a rope. The staff turned out thin, like a spear. Trold had grown accustomed to a spear, so the staff had to feel like a spear. Dan made a pommel from a scrap of horn for a spearman's grip, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top, so the hand would rest as if on a spear shaft. And at the bottom of the cane, he left a hollow tip, removable, underneath which a sting was hidden. 10 centimeters of sharpened steel, not for attack, for self-assurance, so the old soldier would know he was still armed. Dan forged for 3 days. This time he didn't talk to the metal, not on purpose. He was just tired after using the scalpel. His hands were weak, his head was heavy. But the work went on, slowly. Torvald came on the 9th day. Dan handed him the cane. Torvald took it, weighed it, gripped it. His eyes changed. Dan saw it. The soldier recognized the grip, recognized the balance, recognized the feel of the shaft in his hand. Torvald took a step, then a second. Then he walked across the entire blacksmith's yard and back, straight, without leaning, without stumbling. The cane didn't bend, it didn't creak. It stood beneath him like a pillar. Torvald stopped. He looked at Dan. He asked how much. Dan said 2 marks. Torvald took a wallet from his belt and placed 5 on the workbench. Dan started to say that it was too much. Torvald cut him off and said that for 20 years he had walked like a cripple, and now he was standing straight, for the first time in 20 years. And if Dan said another word about the price, Torvald would hit him over the head with that cane. Dan took the 5 marks. On the 10th day, Dan heard the ringing for the first time. Quiet, high-pitched, as if someone had run a wet finger along the rim of a glass. He woke up to the sound and sat up on his cot by the wall. It was dark in the smithy. The forge had cooled down, but the ringing continued. Dan lit a candle and followed the sound. He walked along the workbench, past the tools, past the hammers, past the anvil. The ringing led him to the corner of the smithy, to where a bundle wrapped in a clean cloth lay on the shelf. Dan unwrapped it. A scalpel. That very one. The one he'd given to Lyra for the surgeon. It was lying here, on the shelf. Dan remembered clearly that he'd given it away, but the scalpel was here, and it was ringing. Dan took it in his hand. The ringing stopped. Instead, warmth came over him. Not heat, not hot, warmth, like a child's palm, like a cup of coffee on a cold day.
The scalpel lay in his hand and was warm. Dan held it up to the candle. The blade glistened. The steel surface bore the same pattern, waves, folds.
But now they were moving, barely perceptibly, like ripples on water. Dan watched and couldn't look away. Then the scalpel twitched, on its own, without his hand. It tilted to the right in his palm, then to the left. Then it rose a millimeter and hovered. Dan stopped breathing. The scalpel hung in the air above his palm, thin, small, glowing with a warm light, and ringing quietly like a lullaby. Dan stood in the dark smithy and looked at the piece of iron that had just come to life. He didn't know what to say, so he said the first thing that came to mind. "Hi." The scalpel swayed, like a nod. Dan swallowed. Okay. What's your name?" He didn't know why he asked, but the scalpel swayed again, and Dan suddenly understood. He knew the name. It had been inside him since the moment of forging, since that night when he thought of the woman who loves to sing and smells of flower. Mabel. The scalpel clinked, high, joyful, like laughter. Then it rose higher and settled on Dan's shoulder. Light, weightless, like a butterfly, and fell silent. Dan stood there, feeling a small, warm weight on his shoulder, and didn't know what to do. Because in his life in Allentown, knives didn't fly. Knives didn't respond to names. Knives didn't come home after they were given away. But Mabel sat on his shoulder and hummed softly, and it was the most real thing he'd felt since the transfer. In the morning, he went to see Lyra, to ask how the scalpel had ended up in the smithy. Lyra opened the door and looked at his shoulder. Her eyes went wide. She said the surgeon had returned the scalpel yesterday, said the instrument was no longer needed. The wound had healed cleanly, but the scalpel was acting strangely. It trembled in his hand. It rang out at night. The surgeon decided it was cursed and placed it on the threshold of the smithy. Dan nodded. Not cursed, just alive. Lyra didn't understand. Dan didn't bother to explain. He asked how Mabel was. Lyra smiled, for the first time in all the days he'd known her. She said Mom got up yesterday, walked to the kitchen on her own, kneaded some dough, and sang. Dan smiled back and walked back. Mabel, the scalpel on his shoulder, jingled the whole way. By the second week, Dan was starting to get used to it, to his new body, to a new world, to the little scalpel that flew around him like a loyal wasp and jingled every time Dan picked up a loaf of bread, as if it wanted to help slice it. He'd prepared her for this, but Mabel was too sharp for bread. She just shredded it into crumbs. Dan told her every time that bread wasn't the enemy. Mabel would jingle indignantly and fly off to the shelf. 5 minutes later, she'd be back. Anna saw the flying scalpel on the third day. She came to the smithy to bring Dan his lunch. She opened the door. Mabel was hovering in the air in front of the anvil, swaying quietly while Dan worked. Anna dropped the plate. Porridge scattered across the floor. Mabel darted toward the door and hovered in front of Anna's face, jingling, menacingly. Dan said calmly, "Mabel, that's Anna. She's bringing food." Mabel turned to Dan, then to Anna,
then reluctantly flew over to the workbench and perched on the edge, but she didn't stop ringing. Anna stood in the doorway and didn't move. She asked what it was. Dan replied that it was a scalpel. Anna said she could see it was a scalpel. She asked why it was flying. Dan replied that he didn't know. Anna looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at Anna. If you can say that about a piece of steel without eyes. Anna asked what its name was. Dan said, Mabel. Anna was silent for a moment. Then she picked up a plate. She scooped up some porridge. She left. She returned 10 minutes later with a new serving. She set it on the workbench. She looked at Mabel. She said it was nice to meet him. Mabel stopped ringing. That was the beginning. Anna started coming every day, not just with food.
She came in the morning and stayed until evening, at first in silence. She sat in the corner and watched Dan work. Then she started helping. She handed him tools. She pumped the bellows. She sorted scrap metal. Dan didn't ask her to. She did it on her own. On the second day, she asked why he forged differently than the others. Dan asked, "How do the others do it?" Anna replied that Gregor struck the anvil quickly and hard, but Dan struck slowly and listened. Dan explained that metal speaks if you listen. Every blow changes the structure. If you strike blindly, the structure breaks. If you listen, it comes together, like dough. Anna shuddered. She said that dough speaks too, if you listen. Dan looked at her. She wasn't joking. She was serious. She had kneaded dough every day for 7 years, and she knew that dough speaks. Dan smiled. Within a week, Anna knew how to stoke the furnace, how to pump the bellows with the right rhythm, how to gauge the temperature by color. Dark red, cherry. Light, cherry. Orange, yellow, white. She picked things up quickly, hands accustomed to hard work, attentive eyes, a clear mind. Dan saw in her something he rarely saw: talent. Not for forging, for understanding. She understood the purpose behind every action, not how, but why. That was more important. At the end of the second week, Dan decided to make her a gift. Not because she asked, she never asked for anything, because he saw her cutting meat at the tavern, with that very knife he had resharpened, and he saw that the knife still didn't suit her. The balance was wrong, the length was wrong. It was a knife made for an unknown buyer, not for Anna. Dan took the last scraps of metal, a piece of a sickle, a scrap of chain, and he began to forge. Not a scalpel, not a cane, a kitchen knife. The most ordinary one, but he was forging it for Anna. He remembered her hands, worked to the bone, with broad palms, with short fingers. He remembered how she cut, quickly, confidently, with short outward strokes, with her right hand resting her index finger on the heel. He made the knife to fit that grip, the blade slightly shorter than standard, the heel wider, the center of gravity 2 centimeters closer to the tip than usual, the handle made of walnut, with a slight curve to fit her palm. He didn't speak to the metal, not on purpose. He was thinking about Anna, about how she silently placed a second plate, about how she'd said it was nice to meet the scalpel, about how she'd been running the tavern alone for 7 years and had forgotten how to want anything for herself. Mabel fluttered around and jingled, discontented, as if she were jealous. Dan told her quietly, "Calm down. It's just a knife." Mabel clinked skeptically and went to sit on the shelf.
Dan finished the knife by morning. He tempered it, sharpened it, checked it, wrapped it in a clean rag, took it to the tavern. Anna was standing behind the counter, wiping mugs.
Dan placed the bundle on the counter. He said it was for her help in the smithy. Anna unwrapped the cloth. She took the knife, weighed it in her hand, and froze. Dan knew that moment. When the knife fits in your hand like an extension of your fingers, when you don't need to get used to it, when it's right from the start. Anna didn't say thank you. She looked at Dan and her eyes reddened. She quickly turned away and started chopping onions. Dan thought it was because of the onion. Mabel on his shoulder jingled softly, with a note that Dan had already learned to recognize. It was a note that said, "You're an idiot." Rumors spread like ripples on water. At first quietly, the surgeon told his wife, the wife told her neighbor, the neighbor told the fabric merchant at the market, the merchant told the mule driver. The mule driver carried the story to the next village. Within 3 weeks, within a 2 days' journey of Glimmerholm, everyone knew about the strange, zero-level blacksmith. That very same loser, Daniel, who suddenly started making knives better than third-level masters. The one whose scalpel found its way to Rue. The one who had helped old Torvald stand upright for the first time in 20 years. People began to come. Not in crowds, one by one, 2 at a time, cautiously, skeptically, hoping. The first to arrive was an elderly woman from a neighboring village. She had walked for 3 days. Her hands ached, her joints were swollen, and her fingers wouldn't straighten. She was a weaver, 30 years at the loom. Now she couldn't work. She asked if Dan could do anything for her. Dan looked at her hands. He asked how she worked, what movements, what kind of loom, what kind of thread. The woman was surprised by the questions, but answered. Dan listened. Then he said he'd be back in a day. He made her a pair of arm braces, thin ones, made of wrought iron with a soft leather lining. The braces encircled her wrists and supported her joints. Inside, Dan had forged springy plates that gently pressed on specific points. They didn't heal, they relieved the strain. Like the orthopedic braces he'd seen in a medical equipment catalog when he was making a scalpel for that surgeon from Philadelphia. The woman put on the wristbands. She wiggled her fingers, bent them, straightened them. Her eyes filled with tears. She paid 1 mark, all she had. Dan wanted to refuse. Anna kicked him under the table at the tavern, and he took it. Then a farmer came asking him to repair a plow. Then a miller came asking to forge a new axle for the millstone. Then a girl from the village came asking to make shears for shearing sheep. Dan worked every day, from morning till night. Anna helped. She pumped the bellows. She handed him tools. She watched the mountain when Dan went off for water or food. Mabe fluttered around the smithy and chirped when someone came in, loud and threatening if it was a stranger, quiet and melodious if it was Anna. Money started coming in, not much, but enough to buy coal, to buy a little iron from a passing merchant, to pay the next installment to the guild. Dan began to live. Not just surviving, but living. He fixed up the smithy. He repaired the bellows properly. He patched the roof. He made himself a proper bed instead of the stone floor. He set up a shelf for tools. On that shelf, Mabel made herself a nest out of rags and lay down there at night. A scalpel sleeping in a nest. Dan shook his head every time he looked at it. By the end of the first month, he had 12 completed orders,
3 marks in reserve after paying the dues, and one problem that grew with each passing day: iron. The local iron was rubbish. Case hardening helped, but it had its limits. Dan couldn't make anything serious out of this material. Knives and gauntlets were one thing, but a blade, a real blade. For that, he needed real steel. And real steel in Furano's cost more than gold. The mines belonged to the guild. Only 4th-level masters and above had access to high-quality ore. A 0 level couldn't buy a single gram. Guild rules. Dan sat in the tavern and thought about it. Anna set a plate of stew in front of him. She sat down across from him. She said someone was looking for him. Dan looked up. Anna said a man had come into the tavern that morning, not a local, tall, in a cloak. He asked about a blacksmith who makes strange things. Anna said she didn't know of any such blacksmith. The man smirked and left. Dan asked what he looked like. Anna described him: tall, dark hair, a scar across his left eyebrow, expensive clothes under a traveling cloak, and a sword. A good sword. At least 6th-level work. Dan nodded. Someone with a good sword and expensive clothes is looking for a 0-level village blacksmith. This isn't a random traveler.
This is reconnaissance. Mabel on his shoulder chimed softly. Low. A warning. Dan covered her with his palm and told her to be quiet. They returned to the smithy. Dan closed the door. He looked at his tools, at the bellows, at the anvil, at the shelf where Mabel had been sleeping. He thought, if someone is looking for him, they'll find him soon. Glimmerholm is a small village. There's nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to run, and no reason to. He was a blacksmith. He worked in the forge. This was his place, the only place in this world that had become his. Dan walked over to the bellows and stoked the fire. If they came, let them find him at work. He began to forge. This time, not for a customer, for himself. For the first time in this world, for himself. He took the last good piece of iron and began to make a hammer. His hammer. Not that crooked tool he'd inherited from the former Daniel. His own. The right one. With a balance he knew by heart. 800 grams. The head slightly rounded. An ash wood handle. 32 centimeters long. He forged all night. By morning, the hammer was ready. Dan took it in his hand and struck the anvil. The ring was clear, even, just right. The hammer fit his hand like a glove. Dan smiled and said to it quietly, "Well, hello. My name is Dan. We'll be working together." The hammer didn't answer. It was ordinary, not alive, just a good tool. But in this world, even a good tool is a luxury. One morning in the 2nd month, Dan woke up to a scream. Anna was standing in the doorway of the smithy. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. She said there were 4 men sitting in the tavern with swords in identical gray cloaks. They said they had come for the blacksmith Daniel on Duke Wayne's orders. Dan stood up, put on his apron, took the hammer. Mabel flew off the shelf and hung by his temple, ringing, sharp, like a siren. Dan told her quietly, calmly, "We're just going to talk." He left the smithy and walked toward the inn. 4 men sat at a table by the far wall.
Gray cloaks, identical, swords at their belts. Their faces were calm and professional, not bandits, mercenaries, disciplined, dangerous. Dan entered the tavern. He left Mabel outside, told her to wait by the door and not to ring. Mabel didn't listen and slipped through the gap above the door frame. She hung in the shadows near the ceiling. Quiet. Dan sensed it but didn't argue. One of the four stood up, the oldest, with a face that had seen enough to be surprised by nothing. He introduced himself as Rain, captain of Duke Wayne's personal guard. He said the Duke had heard of Blacksmith Daniel's talents and would like to offer him a position, a good salary, access to the best mines, a workshop at the castle. Everything a master craftsman needs. Dan asked what would happen if he refused. Rain smiled. He replied that the Duke was a persistent man and that it was best to accept the offer the first time.
Because the second time, the terms would be worse, and there wouldn't be a third time. Dan looked at him, then at the other three, then at Anna, who was standing behind the counter holding his knife. The very one that he had made for her. She held it as if she were about to cut something other than an onion. Dan said he would think about it. Rain nodded. He said Dan had 3 days, then they'd come back for an answer. The four of them stood up and left, silently, in an orderly fashion, like a squad used to working together. When the door closed, Anna exhaled. Her hands were shaking. Dan walked over to her and gently took the knife from her fingers. He said she shouldn't have. Anna replied that she wouldn't have, probably. Dan smiled. Mabel flew down from the ceiling and landed on his shoulder. She chirped softly and angrily. Dan returned to the smithy and sat down to think. Duke Wayne. He'd heard that name from the tax collector and from Torvald. Wayne was the richest man in the kingdom. He owned mines, lands, an army of mercenaries, and he wanted his own blacksmith who made unusual things. Dan understood what that meant. A golden cage. Comfortable, secure, but a cage. He would forge not for people, but for the Duke. Not out of necessity, but by order. And living blades would cease to be alive. Because he didn't work in batches for sale. He already knew that. 3 days. In 3 days, he had to solve a problem that couldn't be solved by force. Dan had no army, no connections, not even a rank. But he has a forge, and hands, and a head. Dan stood up and went to Torvald. The old soldier lived in a small house on the outskirts of the village, alone. Dan knocked. Torvald opened the door. With the cane Dan had made for him, standing straight. Dan asked what he knew about Duke Wayne. Torvald invited him inside, poured him something bitter from a clay jug, and told him. Wayne controls the southern provinces. 3,000 mercenaries. 12 mines. He doesn't claim the throne. He's smarter than that. He claims the economy. Whoever controls the steel controls everything, especially now that the Grey Horde is in the east and the king needs weapons. Wayne is buying up blacksmiths, literally. He offers an offer you can't refuse. Whoever refuses disappears. Doesn't die, just disappears, and turns up a year later in Wayne's basement workshop, chained to an anvil. Dan listened, then asked if there was a way to refuse Wayne and survive. Torvald looked at him for a long time. Then he said there was one way. The royal charter. If a blacksmith receives a direct order from the crown, he becomes untouchable. Neither the Duke nor the Guild nor anyone else has the right to touch him until the order is fulfilled. Dan asked how to get an order from the crown. Torvald chuckled and replied that to do so, one must be at least 5th level, or do something that would make the crown come to you. Dan and left. He walked back to the smithy and thought, Level 5 is impossible. The stone will show 0. So the second option, do something that would make the crown take notice on its own. Something impossible. Something no one in this world had done in 300 years. He walked into the smithy. Mabel sat on the shelf, ringing softly. Dan looked at her, then at his new hammer, then at the bellows. He said aloud, "All right, enough with forging knives. It's time to forge a sword." Mabel jumped up and jingled in approval. Dan spent the next day preparing. He gathered all the metal he had. He went through every piece, sorted them by quality. He set aside the best pieces for the blade, the average ones for the blade. He'd remelt the worst ones for the guard. Then he sat down and began to think about who it was for. You can't forge a sword into the void. He already knew that. Who is this sword for? Dan closed his eyes. Anna stood before him. Not a warrior, not a soldier. A woman who has been running the tavern on her own for 7 years, who has never once asked for anything for herself, who comes to the smithy every day and helps in silence. No, the sword is not for Anna. Anna has already received her blade. A kitchen knife. Her blade, Torvald, the old spearman with the new cane, he had already received his. Dan opened his eyes. He didn't know who this sword was for, and that was a problem, because without a specific person, the blade won't come to life. And he needs a living blade. He needs a miracle. Because in 2 days, rain will return, and he needs an answer. That evening, Dan sat by the forge and stared at the coals. Mabel hung nearby and was silent. For the first time ever, she wasn't even ringing, as if she were thinking too. There was a knock at the door. Quiet. Dan opened it. A boy was standing on the threshold, about 7 years old, small, skinny, with huge eyes on a thin face. He was silent and looked up at Dan. Dan asked what he wanted. The boy said his name was Owen, that his dad was a soldier, that he'd gone to war a year ago and hadn't come back. Mom says he died. But Owen doesn't believe it, because Dad promised to come back, and Dad never lied. Dan was silent. The boy continued. He said he'd heard about a blacksmith who makes magical things, and he had come to ask for a favor. Dan asked what he wanted. Owen looked him in the eyes and said, "Forge my dad for me." Dan didn't move. He stood in the doorway of the smithy, looking at the boy, and the world around him grew very quiet. Mabel froze behind him. The coals in the forge stopped crackling. Even the wind died down. Dan crouched down. Slowly, he took the boy's hand, small, cold, just like Lyra's had been back then. He said quietly, "I can't forge a dad. No one can." Owen lowered his eyes. Dan said, "Wait." He asked what Dad liked. Owen thought for a long time. Then he answered, Dad loved carving wood. He made figurines, horses, dogs, toy soldiers. Every evening after dinner, he'd sit on the porch and carve. And he taught Owen. But Owen doesn't know how. He doesn't have a knife. Dad took his with him to the war. Dan nodded. He said, "Come back tomorrow." Dan worked all night. Not a sword, a small wood-carving knife, the size of a child's palm, with a short blade curved like a claw, with a handle made of linden wood, the same linden wood that's carved with such a knife, so the handle would smell just like the shavings, so that every time the boy picked up the knife, he would smell that scent, the scent of evenings on the porch with his father. Dan forged and thought of Owen, small, skinny, with eyes that hadn't quite believed yet. He thought of his father, a soldier who sat down every evening and carved figures for his son, who promised to return, who didn't return. Dan struck with the hammer and spoke to the metal, quietly, as always. He said, "Listen, you're about to become something special. A little hand will hold you. 7 years old, clumsy. You'll have to guide that hand, show it where to cut, how to press, how to turn. You must know what his father knew, not because you remember it, but because I'm putting it into you right now. Every blow is one stroke of the chisel. Every spark is a single shavings. You'll teach him. When I'm not around, when his mom isn't around, when he's alone on the porch at night and he misses his father, you'll be there." The hammer came down. The metal sang. Mabel hung in the corner and was silent. She wasn't jealous. She didn't ring. For the first time ever, she was completely still, as if she were listening. By morning, the knife was ready. Small, warm, with a blade that caught the light and refracted it so that glints resembling leaves danced across the surface. Dan wrapped it in a rag and went to sleep. He slept for 12 hours, a heavy, dead sleep without dreams. When he woke up, his hands were shaking. His head was empty. Just like after that incident with Mabel. The same weakness, the same emptiness, as if he'd given away a piece of himself along with the knife. Owen came by in the evening. He stood in the doorway, shifting from foot to foot. Dan handed him the bundle. The boy unwrapped it. He saw the knife. He took it in his hand. The blade was small, just right for his palm. The handle smelled of linden. Owen pressed the knife to his chest and looked at Dan. He wasn't crying. He asked how much it cost. Dan said nothing. Owen shook his head. He rummaged in his pocket and pulled out a wooden figurine, a horse, small, roughly carved. One ear was shorter than the other. He said it was the last figurine his dad had carved. He wanted to give it to Dan, because now he could carve new ones himself. Dan took the little horse, a small wooden horse with one ear shorter than the other, and he placed it on the shelf next to Mabel's nest. Mabel looked at the horse, then at Dan. Then she shifted over carefully and made room. Owen left. Dan sat down on the bench and looked at the wooden horse on the shelf. Anna came in an hour later with dinner. She saw his face. She didn't say anything. She set down the plate. She sat down next to him. They sat in silence, and that was right. 4 days passed. The knife hadn't woken up. Dan wasn't worried. Mabel woke up on the 7th day. Maybe this knife needed more time, maybe less.
He didn't know the rules, because there were no rules. On the 5th day, a boy from the village ran up to Dan, out of breath. He said that Owen was sitting on the porch of his house and crying, and that the knife was moving. Dan went, quickly. He was almost running. Mabel flew alongside him. Anna rushed out of the tavern and followed him. Owen's house stood by the road, small, crooked. A boy was sitting on the porch, a knife in his hand. A piece of linden wood lay on the step nearby, and shavings, lots of shavings. Owen was crying.
Not from grief, from something else. Dan walked over and sat down next to him.
He looked at the piece of linden wood. A face was emerging from it, rough, unfinished, but recognizable. A man's face, with a broad chin and kind eyes. Owen turned to Dan. He said the knife was doing it on its own. It was guiding his hand. He said it was as if Dad were holding his hand and showing him the way, just like before, every evening on the porch. Dan looked at the face emerging from the wood, at the boy with wet cheeks and a knife in his hand, at the small blade that glowed softly with a warm light. He asked what the knife's name was. Owen looked at the knife, then at Dan, and said one word. Dad. Dan nodded. Mabel on his shoulder jingled softly, not jealously, gently. Anna stood behind Dan and said nothing. Then she put her hand on his shoulder, heavy, warm. Dan didn't turn around.
He sat and watched as the small knife guided the small hand, and from a piece of linden wood emerged the face of a man the boy would never see again. The village saw it. Neighbors came out of their houses. They stood and watched. The old woman by the well, the very one who had spat in Dan's direction on the first day, crossed herself. One of the men took off his hat. Owen's mother stood in the doorway of the house, covering her mouth with her hand. She wasn't crying. She was looking at her son, and at the knife, and at the face carved from wood. And she couldn't breathe. Dan stood up. It was time to go. Rain would be back tomorrow, and he needed an answer. He walked toward the smithy. Anna walked beside him, silently. Halfway there, she said one thing. She said she knew for whom he should forge the sword. Dan looked at her. Anna said, "For the village." Not for a person. For Glimmerholm. For everyone who lives here. For Owen and his mom. For Lyra and Mabel. For Torvald. For the old weaver. For the miller. For everyone. Dan stopped. He stood in the middle of the dusty village street and thought. Anna waited. He said it didn't work that way. A blade only comes to life if it's forged for a specific person, for a specific need. Anna nodded. She said that the specific person was Dan, and the specific need was to protect what he had built. Mabel jingled on his shoulder. Dan looked at Anna. She didn't look away. He went into the smithy, lit the forge, and began to forge. Dan forged the sword for 2 days straight, without stopping, without sleep, without food. Anna brought water and set it by the door. He didn't notice. Mabel fluttered around the forge and kept a safe distance from the flames, as if she knew she mustn't disturb him now. There wasn't much metal left.
Dan took everything that remained, every scrap, the chain from the well, the shards of a sickle, 3 old nails, the rusty door bolt he'd removed from his own door, and that horseshoe.
The last piece, the one left over after the scalpel, for Mabel. He remelted it all, sorted it by carbon content, the best pieces for the core, the medium ones for the cladding, the worst for the tang. Cementation, layering, forging. 100 layers, 200, 500. He didn't count. He listened. The metal spoke to him in a language that had no words, only tone, only vibration, only warmth beneath his fingers. Dan forged and thought, not about himself, about Glimmerholm, about the village that had taken him in. No, didn't take him in, endured him, and then saw what he could do, and began to come, one by one, in need, in pain, with hope. He thought of Lyra, who cried on the threshold of his forge, of Torvald, who had walked like a cripple for 20 years, of Owen, who asked him to forge a crutch, of Anna, who silently piled a second plate, about everyone, about each one. The hammer fell, and every blow was a name. Lyra, Torvald, Owen, Anna, Mabel, Gregor, the miller. The weaver. Every blow was an answer to a question no one asked. Why are you here? Dan struck with the hammer and knew why. He was here because these people had heard him, and he had heard them, and that was reason enough to stay. The blade took shape slowly, straight, wide, heavier than a tactical knife, lighter than a 2-handed sword. The blade was 45 centimeters long, single-edged, a slight curve along the spine, something between a European falchion and a Japanese wakizashi, a mongrel blade, not fitting into any school, just like Dan himself. He tempered it with clay, like a scalpel, but thicker, more meticulously. The hamon line ran in a wave from the ricasso to the tip, wide, uneven, beautiful. Dan dipped the blade into the water. Steam shot up to the ceiling, the forge filled with a white cloud. Mabel flew back against the wall and clinked indignantly. When the steam cleared, Dan pulled the blade out. He looked at it, wiped it, ran his finger along the edge.
The metal was cold, dead. Ordinary good steel, not alive. Dan wasn't surprised. He knew that awakening takes time. Mabel woke up on the 7th day. Owen's little knife on the 5th. Maybe this blade would wake up in a week, maybe in a month, or maybe never. Because Dan wasn't sure that forging for himself was the same as forging for someone else. He made a handle, out of oak, wrapped it in leather, fitted it, wedged it in, took it in his hand. Heavy, unfamiliar. Dan wasn't a swordsman, he was a blacksmith. But the sword lay evenly in his hand, the balance at the heel, just as he'd calculated. For short, chopping strikes with one hand, the other hand free for the hammer. A blacksmith with a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other. Silly, but Dan didn't know any other way. He leaned the sword against the wall, sat down on the floor, and fell asleep. This time, he slept for 2 days. Anna came by, checked on him, tucked him in, Mabel sat on the shelf and kept watch.
Whenever someone approached the door, Mabel would fly out and jingle so loudly that the person would take 3 steps back. Dan woke up that morning when Rain returned. He knew he'd slept too long. He knew he was late. The 3 days Rain had given him were up. He stood up. His head was spinning. His hands felt like rags. He walked over to the water barrel and poured water over his head. Then he put on his apron. He picked up the hammer. He looked at the sword against the wall. The sword was silent, cold, dead, ordinary, fine. So no miracles. Dan walked out of the smithy. 12 men stood in the square in front of the inn, not 4 like last time, 12, in gray cloaks, with swords. Rain stood at the front, behind him a line, organized, silent. The villagers had hidden. The street was empty. Only Torvald stood by his house, with a cane, upright, and Anna in the tavern doorway, with a knife in her hand. Rain looked at Dan, said 3 days had passed. Dan nodded. Rain asked what the answer was. Dan looked at the 12 mercenaries, at Rain, at the village behind them. He said no. Rain wasn't surprised. He nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. Then he made a gesture with his hand. 4 mercenaries broke ranks and moved toward Dan. Mabel flew out from behind him, a small scalpel, thin as a needle, a flying piece of steel that weighs less than an apple. It hovered between Dan and the mercenaries and rang out, loudly, piercingly, so that the nearest mercenary's face twitched. Rain raised his hand. The mercenary stopped. He looked at the flying scalpel for a long time. Then he looked at Dan. He said he now understood why the Duke was interested. He said it changed the terms. The Duke needed a blacksmith who made living weapons, not just good knives, living weapons. And for that, the Duke was willing to pay any price. Dan replied that living weapons couldn't be bought. Rain smiled. He said that everything can be bought. It's a matter of currency. Sometimes the currency is gold. Sometimes it's fear. He gave the signal again. The mercenaries turned around, all 12 of them, and left. Rain lingered. He looked at Dan, at Mabel, at the inn where Anna stood. He said he would return, and that next time there wouldn't be 12 of them. Then he left. The village breathed a sigh of relief. Torvald walked up to Dan and said one word. Bad. Dan nodded. He knew. After the mercenaries left, the village changed. Not right away, slowly, like dough rising in the warmth. The miller was the first to arrive, a big, silent man with flour-stained hands. He stood before Dan and said that if he needed help, he was there. Then Gregor came, a second-tier blacksmith, the very one who had bought Dan's knives. He brought with him a sack of coal and 2 pieces of iron. Good iron. He said it wasn't a gift, but an investment. Then Owen's mother came, a quiet woman with a gray face. She didn't speak. She brought a basket of food and set it by the smithy door and left. By evening, 12 people had gathered at the smithy. Not an army. Farmers, a miller, a baker, an old weaver in the armbands Dan had made, boys, girls, Lyra with her younger brother, Owen with a knife on a string around his neck, Torvald with his cane, Anna.
They stood there in silence. Dan stepped out of the smithy and looked at them. He didn't know what to say. He was a blacksmith, not a commander, not a hero, not a leader. He made knives. Torvald spoke for everyone. He said that Glimmerholm had stood on this spot for 200 years. It wasn't burned down in the Wars of the Three Crowns. It wasn't washed away by the flood of 15. It won't be destroyed by some duke. Not while people still live here. Dan nodded. He turned toward the smithy. He looked at the bellows, and he said one thing. He needed iron. Lots of iron. Everything in the village. Every nail, every hinge, every horseshoe, every scrap. He would reforge it all.
Over the next 3 days, Glimmerholm stripped itself down to iron. People brought everything. Rusty locks, old chains, broken tools, bent hinges. One farmer brought a plowshare. Another brought a wheel rim. A third brought a bucket of nails pulled from the walls of his own barn. Dan sorted them, day and night. Anna helped. Gregor helped. Even the miller stood by the bellows. Dan taught them, briefly, clearly. The temperature is this. The coal is that. The bellows at this rhythm. Gregor listened and shook his head. He had been forging for 20 years and had never thought about temperature and numbers. For him, it was hot and very hot. And Dan told him light cherry, that's about 800 degrees, and for welding you need white, that's 1200. Gregor looked at him as if he were mad, but he did as he was told. Dan didn't forge weapons. He forged protection. From a plowshare, he made door plates for the tavern, thick ones, with stiffening ribs. From chains, he forged bolts. From nails, a set of staples for a barricade. From a wheel rim, a shield. 1. Small, round, for Torvald. The old soldier took the shield in his left hand, a cane in his right. He stood up straight, and for the first time in all that time, an expression appeared on his face that Dan recognized. It was the face of a man who was back where he belonged. Dan worked and didn't sleep for 3 days. Anna made him eat, literally. She stood over him with a plate until he finished. Mabel helped. She nagged him until he picked up a spoon. On the 3rd day, Dan was done. The smithy was empty. Not a single piece of metal. Everything had been reforged. Everything had been distributed. The village was bristling with iron. Not pretty, not professional, but sturdy. Dan sat on the threshold of the smithy and watched the sunset. Anna sat down beside him. She was silent. Then she said he had forgotten about himself. Dan didn't understand. Anna pointed to his sword. It stood against the wall inside the smithy.
Cold, silent, dead. Dan shrugged. He said maybe it wasn't meant to be alive. Maybe some things just remain things. Anna looked at him and said he was a fool. Then she stood up and left. Mabel clinked on the shelf, in agreement. That night, Dan lay on the cot and couldn't sleep. He thought about the sword, about why it hadn't awakened. He'd forged it for himself, to protect the village. He'd imbued it with names. He'd struck it with the hammer with intent. He'd done everything just as he had with Mabel, just as he had with Owen's knife. But the sword remained silent. Maybe because you can't forge for yourself. Maybe because protecting the village is too abstract. Maybe because he was lying to himself and was actually forging it out of fear. And fear is not need. Fear is the opposite of need. Need tells me I need this exact tool right now for this exact purpose. Fear tells me I need anything at all.
Dan lay in the darkness and listened to the silence.
Mabel slept in her nest. The village slept. Somewhere far away, a dog howled. Then he heard another sound. Quiet, low, vibrating. Not a ringing, a hum. Dan sat up. The sound was coming from the wall, from the sword. He stood and walked over. The sword stood where he had left it, leaning against the stone. Dan reached out and touched the hilt. The metal was warm, not hot, warm, like a child's palm, like Mabel the first time. The sword hummed, quietly, low, as if breathing in its sleep. Dan gripped the hilt and lifted the blade, heavy, but warm, alive, not yet awake, but alive, like a baby a week before birth. It's already moving. It's already hearing, but it hasn't opened its eyes yet. Dan held the sword and felt the warmth radiating from the metal in slow waves, like a pulse. He said quietly, "Don't rush. You'll wake up when you're ready. I'll wait." The sword hummed, once, briefly, like an answer. Dan put it back, lay down,
and fell asleep. In the morning, he woke up to Torvald's shout. The old soldier was standing on the hill behind the village, shouting that there was dust on the road. A lot of dust, coming from the south. Dan went out and looked. A cloud was rising on the horizon above the road, a big one, reddish. That kind of dust isn't kicked up by 4 or 12 men. That kind of dust is kicked up by a detachment. Dan returned to the smithy. He put on his apron. He took the hammer in his right hand. He looked at the sword. The sword was silent. It wasn't humming, but it was warm. Dan took it in his left hand. Mabel flew off the shelf and hovered by his temple. She rang, high-pitched, alarming. Dan stepped out of the smithy and stood in the yard. Anna came out of the tavern with a knife. Torvald came down the hill with a staff and a shield. The miller stood by the bar with a pitchfork. Gregor took a hammer, his own, heavy, blunt, but in the blacksmith's hands, a hammer is a hammer. They stood and waited. The dust was approaching.
And then the dust settled, and out of the cloud came not an army. Out of the cloud came a girl, alone, short, thin, in torn clothes, with 2 wounds on her shoulder bandaged with a dirty rag. She walked 10 paces down the village street, stopped, looked at Dan, at the hammer in his hand, at the flying scalpel by her temple, at the villagers with pitchforks and kitchen knives, and fell face first into the dust. Mabel darted toward her, hovered over the body, ringed, not threateningly, anxiously, like a signal. Dan dropped the hammer and ran over, turned the girl over. Young, Asian features, short-cropped black hair, a chain mark on her neck, shackle marks on her wrists, 2 deep-cut wounds on her shoulder. Dan looked at Anna. He said, "Water. Hot." "Clean rags." Anna nodded and ran off. Dan lifted the girl into his arms and carried her into the smithy. He laid her on the bench. Mabel hovered over her, ringing softly, anxiously.
The dust on the road wasn't from the army. The dust was from a storm, a southern one, a desert one. One that had been hot on the girl's heels as if driving her here, or covering her. Dan didn't know who she was, didn't know where she was from, but he saw the shackle marks and the blade wounds, and that was enough. He took a clean rag. The girl came to after a day. Dan was sitting at the workbench sharpening a chisel when she opened her eyes, abruptly, as if from a blow. In one motion she slid off the cot and pressed her back against the wall. Her eyes darted around the smithy. Her hands searched for a weapon. Mabel flew off the shelf and hovered between her and Dan. It clinked. A warning. Dan didn't move. He said calmly, "You're safe. This is a smithy. I'm a blacksmith. No one will touch you." The girl looked at the flying scalpel, at Dan, at the bellows, at her bandaged wounds. Then she slowly sank to the floor. Mabel didn't move away. She hung there and rang, quietly but insistently. Dan said to her calmly, "Mabel, she's wounded." Mabel hesitated. Then she reluctantly flew over to the shelf, but she didn't land. She stood on her side and watched. The girl was silent for 2 hours. She sat by the wall and stared at the floor. Dan didn't ask. He worked. He sharpened the chisel. He honed the cutters. He did the usual things. He gave her time. Anna brought food, twice. She set the plate down next to the girl. She didn't touch it. Then Anna brought broth, hot, thick, smelling of herbs. She set it down and left. The girl looked at the broth, at the door behind which Anna had disappeared. Then she picked up the bowl and drank it in one gulp. After the broth, she spoke. Her name was Kim So-yeon. She was a novice of the Order of Holy Steel. Dan didn't know what the Order of Holy Steel was. So-yeon explained briefly and without emotion. The Order is a religious organization that believes weapons must be lifeless. Steel serves man, not the other way around. Any blacksmith who tries to breathe life into metal is a heretic. 300 years ago, the Order destroyed the last masters of living forging. Since then, they have made sure no one repeats it. Dan listened, and a chill ran through him. So-yeon continued. She wasn't just a novice. She was an executioner. She had been trained since she was 12. Swordplay, tactics, tracking, killing. She had executed 11 blacksmiths on the Order's orders, 11 people who had tried to bring metal to life. None of them had succeeded. None had seen it through to the end. The Order had found them first. Dan asked why she had run away. So-yeon fell silent for a long time. Then she said that the last blacksmith she had executed was an old man, 60 years old, blind in one eye. He forged toy swords for children, small ones, wooden with iron pommels. They weren't alive, not even close, but the old man talked to them. He gave them names. And one of the neighbors ratted him out. So-yeon came at night. The old man didn't resist. He looked at her with his one eye and said one thing. He said that steel isn't to blame for the fear people put into it. Steel simply responds to what is put into it. If you put love into it, it with love. If you put hatred into it, it will respond with hatred. So-yeon killed him. She carried out the order, and then she couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. Because he was right. And she knew it. She had fled the Order a month ago.
They had pursued her, caught her, chained her. She broke free, was wounded, ran on, headed north, not knowing where. Because, according to rumors, there was a blacksmith in the north who made living things. And she wanted to see. She wanted to understand. If it was true, or just another lie to which she had dedicated her life. Dan listened. When she finished, he stood up and walked over to the shelf. He picked up Mabel. The small scalpel lay in his palm. Warm. Alive.
Quietly ringing. Dan held out his hand to So-Yun. She looked at the scalpel. Then she slowly reached out and touched the blade with her fingertip. Mabel didn't cut her. Mabel twitched. Quietly. Like a cat that's unsure of a new person but doesn't hiss. So-Yun pulled her hand away. Her eyes were wet. She said one word. Alive. Dan nodded. So-Yun stayed in the smithy for a week. Her wounds were healing. Anna changed her bandages. Mabel gradually got used to it and stopped ringing every time So-Yun moved. 3 things happened that week. First, Dan learned from So-Yun about the world than in the previous 2 months. She told him about the Grey Horde, the monsters from the eastern wastes. They were advancing slowly but surely. Ordinary steel shattered against their hide. To fight them, you needed blades of at least 5th level, or living ones. She told him about the king and the great call, about the schism in the guild, about Duke Wayne, who was buying up blacksmiths,
about the Order's Inquisitor, Sir Corvin Ash, who personally hunted down the creators of living weapons. Second, Dan learned that So-Yun wielded a blade as he wielded a hammer. Perfectly, precise, deadly. She trained every morning in the blacksmith yard with a stick instead of a sword. Dan watched and saw. Quick, short movements. Economical. Not a single wasted one. Every strike landed exactly where it needed to. It wasn't a style. It was murder elevated to an art form. And So-Yun hated herself for it. The third time, the sword hummed again. At night, quietly, deeply. Dan woke up and placed his hand on the hilt. The sword was warm, warmer than before. His pulse quickened. He was waking up. Slowly, but waking up. On the 8th day, Dan called So-Yun over to the workbench. He said he wanted to make her a weapon. So-Yun froze. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked why. Dan answered, "Because you came here to see life. Well, you'll see it. Not from the sidelines. With your own hands." So-Yun asked what kind of weapon. Dan asked in return what she was best at wielding. So-Yun answered without hesitation, "A pair of daggers." Dan nodded. He asked her for their names. So-Yun didn't understand. Dan explained. He gives each blade a name as he forges it, but the names must come from the person they're meant for. So-Yun thought for a long time. Then she said 2 names, Jean and Soon. Dan asked what they meant. So-Yun replied that Jean meant truth and Soon meant submission. She paused. Then she added, all her life she had been submissive to what she considered the truth. Now she wanted truth and submission to be in her hands, not hanging over her head. Dan began to forge. Dan forged the daggers for 3 days. There wasn't much metal. Gregor brought 2 pieces from his own supplies, the best he had. Dan thanked him and got to work. He forged Chin and Soon at the same time, from a single piece. He split the blank in two and forged both halves in parallel.
A blow to the left. A blow to the right. A flip. A blow to the left. A blow to the right. 2 daggers from a single heart. Twins. He forged and thought of So-Yun, about the girl who had been killing on command for 12 years and who was now sitting in the smithy courtyard sharpening a training stick. He thought about her hands, small, quick, calloused from the hilt, not from work, from weapons. Those hands knew only one thing: to kill. And So-Yun hated them for it. Dan wanted to give her different hands, not new ones, the same ones, but with a different purpose, not to kill, to protect. He spoke to the metal as he forged, quietly, in English. He said, "You two, you will be a pair. You'll work together like a right and a left hand. Chin. You'll know the truth, always, without exception. If the blow is aimed at an innocent, you'll stop. If the blow is aimed at your back, you won't fall. Only the truth. Son, you will listen, not to orders, not to duty, not to fear, only to her." So-Yun. Only her voice. Only her choice. You are subject only to her, and no one else. The daggers took shape under his hammer, short, 20 centimeters of blade, double-edged, with a small guard, lightweight, for a quick hand, for an interception, for a throw, for a return. Dan balanced them slightly closer to the tip, for accuracy. So-Yun worked with the tip. He could tell from her training. The cunning lay in the edge, not the mass. Tempering, clay, water, steam. The hamon on both daggers turned out differently. On Chin, a straight, thin line, like an arrow, like a death sentence. On Soon, wavy and soft, like a river, like forgiveness. Dan smiled. The metal knew the character before he did. He made the handles from black wood. He found a scrap at the miller's, dense, heavy, with a matte sheen. He wrapped a thin strip of leather cross of, like the handles of Japanese tantos. So-Yun would appreciate it. He knew. On the 4th day, the daggers were ready. Dan went to bed and slept for a full day. Anna was on watch. Mabel was on watch. So-Yun walked around the yard and looked at the smithy door. She didn't go in. She waited. Dan woke up in the evening. He called for So-Yun. She entered. He handed her 2 daggers. On a rag, side by side, twins. Black handles, dark blades, thin lines of hamon. So-Yun took Chin in her right hand, Sun in her left. She froze. Dan saw how her face changed. She recognized the grip, the balance, the weight. Everything was made for her. Exactly, perfectly, as if the daggers were growing out of her palms. So-Yun went out into the courtyard. She took a stance and began to move. Dan watched. He had never seen anything like it. It was a dance. No, it was a conversation. So-Yun moved, and the daggers responded. Every turn, every lunge, every block. They weren't alive, not yet,
but they were already hers. So Yun stopped. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, breathing heavily, breathing and crying.
Silently, without a sound, tears streamed down her cheeks and fell into the dust. Dan didn't approach. Anna didn't approach. Mabel was silent. They all stood and waited. Soo-Yun wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Dan and said that she would stay. Here, in Glimmerholm, by his side. And if anyone came for him, they would have to get past her. Dan nodded. Chin and Sun woke up a week later, at the same time, at night. So-Yun was sleeping in the courtyard, wrapped in a cloak. The daggers lay nearby, and suddenly both of them rose, quietly, in unison. They hovered over the sleeping So-Yun a hand's breadth away, and began to circle, slowly, like two guards on patrol. So-Yun woke to a soft ringing. She saw the daggers above her. She wasn't afraid. She reached out her hands. Chin lay in her right hand, Sun in her left. Warm, alive. And for the first time in 5 years, So-Yun allowed herself to smile. Mabel watched from the shelf, jealously. 2 days after the daggers awoke, what Dan had feared happened. A rider appeared on the road, alone, in a white cloak with a silver symbol on his chest, a crossed anvil, the insignia of the Order of Holy Steel. So-Yun saw him first. Her face went pale. She said one name: Corvin. Sir Corvin Ashe, the Inquisitor. He was riding alone, without a squad, without haste, on an old horse. Dan stepped forward to meet him. So-Yun stood behind him, Chin and Sun in her hands. Mabel hung by Dan's temple. Corvin stopped his horse, dismounted. He was tall, 40 years old, a gaunt face, deep-set eyes, gray at the temples. He looked at Dan, at the flying scalpel, at the daggers in So-Yun's hands, and his face twisted with pain. Not anger, pain. He said he had not come with a sword. He had come to talk. Dan looked at So-Yun. She was tense as a bowstring. Chin and Sun trembled in her hands. Dan placed his hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Let him speak." They sat by the extinguished forge. Dan, Corvin, an anvil between them. Soo-Yun stood by the door. She didn't leave. Chin and Sun hung from her shoulders. Mabel sat on the shelf and tinkled, quietly, not threateningly, warily. Corvin looked at Mabel for a long time. Then he spoke. He told his story. 20 years ago, he was a different man, a 7th-level master, one of the best blacksmiths of his generation. He had a wife, Elena. He loved her the way people obsessed with their craft know how to love, too strongly, too deeply, too much through his work. He forged for her a blade, a sword, a living one. He poured everything he felt into it, every fear, every jealousy, every desperate desire to hold on. The sword awoke and became what he had made it: jealous, desperate, greedy. When Elena once spoke to a young merchant at the market, she simply spoke.
The sword struck on its own, without a command, without a reason, out of the pure jealousy Corvin had poured into it. Elena died. Corvin broke the sword with his bare hands.
The blade screamed as it broke.
It screamed in his voice, because a part of his soul was in it, the part that didn't know how to love properly. Corvin renounced the gift, joined the order, and devoted the rest of his life to ensuring no one else would repeat his mistake. Dan listened. He was silent. When Corvin finished, Dan asked one thing. He asked what the sword's name was. Corvin flinched. Then he answered quietly, Elena. He had named the sword after his wife. Dan nodded. He understood. He understood everything. Corvin hadn't put love into the sword. He had put the fear of loss into it. And the sword became what they had made it. Fear. Dan stood up and walked to the corner of the smithy. There, in a box under the workbench, lay the shards. He had been collecting them, every piece of metal he found, sorting them, memorizing them. Among the shards were 2 pieces of an old blade. Dan had found them a month ago in the smithy's attic. He didn't know whose they were.
But they were different. The steel was better than anything he had seen in this world. Dense, resonant, with a pattern that resembled neither Damascus nor Hamon. Something else. Something ancient. He brought the shards and placed them before Corvin. He asked him, "Is this your sword?" Corvin looked at the shards. His hands trembled. He didn't touch them. He said, "Yes. These are fragments of Elena." "But that's impossible. He broke her 20 years ago, threw her into the river." Dan said the fragments were found in the attic of this smithy. Maybe the river carried them here. Maybe someone picked them up. Maybe the blade found its way here on its own. Corvin stared at the shards, his hands trembling. Dan spoke softly. "I can reforge it." Corvin looked up. His eyes were filled with horror. He said, "No, it couldn't be done. It had killed Elena." Dan shook his head. He said the sword hadn't killed her. It was the fear Corvin had instilled in it that had done the killing. If reforged with a different cause, the blade would become different. Not jealous, not greedy, the way Corvin would have wanted Elena to remember him. Corvin was silent for a long time. So-Yun stood by the door and was silent too. Chin and Sun sank into her arms and fell quiet. Mabel stopped ringing. The smithy was completely silent. Then Corvin said one word. "Yes." Dan forged all night. He took 2 shards of the old blade and placed them in the forge. The metal heated slowly. It resisted, as if it remembered the pain. Dan spoke to it, quietly. He said, "I know you're in pain. I know you remember. But the one who made you has changed. He's not that man anymore. For 20 years he carried the guilt of putting the wrong part of himself into you. Now he wants to put in another. The one that remembers how Elena laughed, how her hair smelled, how she'd put her hand on his shoulder when he stood at the forge. You're not a weapon. You're a memory. Be a memory." The hammer came down. The shards fused together, slowly, reluctantly, then faster. Then the metal gave way and flowed beneath the hammer, like tears. Corvin sat by the wall and watched. He didn't help, he didn't interfere, he just watched. By morning, the blade was ready. Not a sword, a small dagger, delicate, with a thin blade, with a white wood hilt. Dan handed it to Corvin. Corvin took it. The dagger fit into his hand, and Corvin closed his eyes. Tears streamed down his face. He said he could feel her. Not jealousy, not fear, warmth, as if Elena had placed her hand on his cheek, just as she did every morning. Dan said the dagger was named Elena, just like before. But now it was a different Elena, the one who forgives. Corvin stood in the middle of the smithy with the small dagger in his hand and wept. Not from grief, from something that had no name in the language of Feranos, but Dan knew that word. Letting go. Corvin dropped to his knees, not before Dan, before the dagger in his hands. He whispered a name. Elena. The dagger glowed softly, with a warm white light. And So-Yun, standing by the door, dropped chin to the floor. Because for the first time in her life, she saw an inquisitor of the Order of Holy Steel on his knees before a living blade. Corvin remained in Glimmerholm, not as an inquisitor, as a man who no longer had a home. He took off his white cloak and hung it on a nail in the smithy. The fabric was heavy, thick, with silver embroidery of a crossed anvil on the back. He had worn that cloak for 20 years. For 20 years it had been his skin. Now the cloak hung on a rusty nail next to Dan's apron and looked like a discarded hide. Dan didn't object. He looked at the cloak, then at Corvin, then went back to work. So-Yun objected for 3 days. Every morning she approached Dan and said that the Inquisitor couldn't be trusted, that Corvin had killed dozens of blacksmiths, that he might reveal their location to the Order, that Island's dagger might be a trick. On the 4th day, she stopped, not because she believed Corvin, because she saw him sitting by the well at dawn, talking to the dagger, quietly, as if to a person, the way Dan talks to metal. So-Yun stood around the corner and listened. Corvin told Eileen that today was a good day, that the sky was clear, that he'd seen a swallow build a nest under the tavern's roof. He described the morning to her as if she could see it. So-Yun left. She didn't object anymore. Chin and Sun still hissed when Corvin walked by, but they no longer lunged. They hovered by So-Yun's shoulders and vibrated, low, warningly, but without aggression. Corvin stopped every time. He looked at the daggers. He nodded at them, like an old wolf acknowledging the young ones. Chin and Sun didn't nod back, but they didn't attack either. For the first week, that was enough. A month had passed, Dan's 3rd month in Feranos. Glimmerholm had changed. No longer a village, but something halfway between a workshop and a fortress. The barriers that Dan had forged from the village's scrap metal stood at the 3 approaches to the village. Bolts secured the doors of the tavern and the 3 nearest houses. Torvald had organized patrols. 3 men, himself, Gregor, and a young farmer named Hurst, who had once served in the militia. They took turns climbing the hill behind the village and watching the roads.
Torvald stood upright at his post, with a cane in one hand and a shield in the other. For 20 years he had been a cripple. Now he was a sentry. The difference lay in 32 centimeters of wrought iron with an ash wood handle. Dan worked every day, from morning till night. The forge never went out. The bellows pumped, the hammer pounded. People came, from neighboring villages, from distant ones, on foot, on mules, in carts. A level 0 blacksmith whose knives fly and daggers guard the sleepers. The rumor became a legend.
The legend spread through the region like wildfire through dry grass. Some came in need. They asked to have things repaired, forged, to sharpen. Others came just to watch. They stood by the smithy fence and watched as Mabel circled above the anvil. The little flying scalpel became a Glimmerholm attraction. Children pointed at her and squealed with delight. Mabel liked it. She looped through the air and rang out. Show off. Dan shook his head and told her that immodesty was a vice. Mabel ignored him. The legend became a problem, because along with the supplicants, others came too. Scouts, spies, people with cold eyes who didn't buy anything and didn't ask for anything. They just stood there, watched, memorized, counted. Corvin recognized them. He had been one of them for 20 years. He would approach Dan and speak quietly. That one by the well in the brown cloak, the guild, and the one with the cart selling pots, Wayne, second time this month. Dan listened, nodded, kept working. He couldn't shut down the village. Didn't want to. People came in need. He couldn't turn away those in need just because spies were hiding among them. That would be like stopping forging because someone might steal a knife. One morning, a carriage pulled up to the village, a fancy one, with a coat of arms on the door, 4 horses, lacquered wood, gold trim. Carriages like that don't travel on country roads. Carriages like that travel between palaces. The village froze. People hid in their homes. Torvald grabbed his cane. So-Yun pulled out Chin and Sun. Mabel soared to the smithy's ceiling and rang out, sharply, like a siren. Dan stepped out into the yard. A girl of about 19 stepped out of the carriage, blonde hair, long, down to her waist, an expensive dress of blue velvet with silver embroidery along the hem, slender arms in white leather gloves, and frightened eyes. Large, gray, with dark circles beneath them, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept for 3 days. She took 3 steps from the carriage and stopped. She looked at the blacksmith shop, at Dan in his apron holding a hammer, at the flying scalpel above his head, at So-Yun with her daggers, at Torvald with his shield. She said her name was Madeline Thorne, that she was Duke Wayne's daughter, that she had run away from home, and that she needed help. Her voice trembled, but she held her chin steady, a habit drilled in over the years. Dan looked at her and thought of the trap. Duke Wayne's daughter, the very same Wayne who had sent rain, who wanted to lock Dan in the basement workshop, and now his daughter was standing on the threshold in an expensive carriage, alone, without guards. Convenient. Too convenient. Mabel was ringing, anxiously. With Jan stood with daggers at the ready. Chin trembled in her right hand, Sun swayed in her left, both ready. Corvin stepped out of the smithy and frowned. He was looking at the coat of arms on the carriage, a crossed boar. Wayne, without a doubt. Anna was silent. She stood in the tavern doorway with a kitchen knife,
and said nothing. Madeline told her, quickly, disjointedly, swallowing her words. Her father was preparing her for a political marriage, to Baron Hoff, old, fat, with 3 previous wives, none of whom had lived past 30. Madeline was a tool, a bargaining chip. She had always known it, but 3 days ago she found the letters in her father's study, in a locked drawer she had opened with a hairpin. In the letters, Wayne discussed with Baron Hoff the exchange of his daughter for control of the northern mines, the exact price. Madeline Thorne equals 4 iron ore mines and 1 silver mine. Like a commodity, like livestock. She read those letters 3 times. Then she carefully put them back. Then she went to her room. She packed a small bag. Then, that night, she stole a carriage from the stable. The coachman was asleep. She took the reins herself. She knew how. Her father had taught her. For fun.
She stole the carriage and drove north. Not to Dan. She didn't know about Dan. Just north. Because to the south is Hoff. To the west is the sea. To the east is the horde. And to the north is the road. And that road brought her here. Dan listened. He stood there with a hammer, listening to a 19-year-old girl in a velvet dress who had driven a carriage alone along country roads for 3 days, without food, without sleep, without guards, with 4 mines listed in place of her name. Then he asked one thing: what she could do. Madeline blinked. She had expected a different question. Who are you? Why did you come? Why should I trust you? Not what you can do. She was taken aback. Then she answered. She said she could read in 4 languages: Common, Old Faranos, Eastern, and the language of the horde, which she had studied out of academic interest. She knew court etiquette, all 214 rules. She played the lute fairly well, and she could manipulate anyone within 10 minutes of conversation, because her father had taught her. From the age of 6, every dinner was a training session, every guest was a target. Get him to agree to 1 dessert for Madeline, and she did. Dan nodded. He said manipulation wasn't needed here, but 4 languages would come in handy, especially the language of the horde. Madeline looked at him, waiting for a catch. Conditions, prices. Dan turned and walked into the smithy. Over his shoulder, he told Anna, "Feed her. 3 days without food is a long time." Anna nodded and led Madeline to the tavern. Mabel watched them go skeptically. So-Yun put away her daggers, but she didn't hide them. She left them on her belt, just in case. Madeline stayed. For the first 3 days, she didn't know what to do. She had never done manual labor, never cleaned up after herself, never cooked. She was a duke's daughter. She had been taught to think, to speak, to manipulate, not to live. Anna gave her a rag and told her to wash the dishes. Madeline washed. Poorly. Anna showed her how to do it right. Madeline tried again. Better. The 3rd time, passable. Anna nodded and left. Madeline stood by the tub of dirty water in her velvet dress, washing plates, and she felt strange. Not humiliated, strange. Because for the first time in her life, she was doing something simple, something with a visible result. A dirty plate became clean. That was it. No need to convince anyone. No need to prove anything. Just wash a plate.
A week later, Dan forged a stiletto for her. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't announce it. He just called her to the smithy one evening and asked her to tell him about herself. Madeline asked warily, what exactly? Dan said, anything, whatever first came to mind. Madeline thought for a long time. Then she began to tell him. About her father's castle, about the cold corridors,
about her mother's portrait in the great hall, which she would gaze at every evening because she didn't remember her face. Her mother had died when Madeline was 3. All that remained was the portrait and the scent. Lilies. Her mother loved lilies. She kept them in every room, and every spring Madeline would search for lilies in the castle garden. She couldn't find any. Her father had ordered all the flowers uprooted after her mother's death. They reminded him too much. Dan listened. Then he nodded. He turned to the horn and began to work. The stiletto was slender, a 20-centimeter blade, narrow, triangular, more of an ornament than a weapon, though if necessary it could pierce chainmail. The handle was made of light ash wood. And the guard was shaped like a lily, small, delicate, with petals of wrought iron so thin they were translucent in the light. Dan forged it separately from the blade. 3 hours for a single guard. He shaped each petal with tweezers. Mabel helped. She held the blank in the air while Dan bent the edges. She grumbled when he worked too slowly. He named the stiletto Lily, not because it was pretty, because Madeline had confessed to him one night by the forge that her only memory of her mother was the scent of lilies. And Dan thought that if he couldn't bring the flower back, he could make it out of steel. Steel lilies don't wilt. The lily stiletto woke up 4 days later and immediately started acting up. It was unexpected. Mabel woke up quietly, like a child who opens her eyes and looks around in silence. Chin and Sun woke up in unison, like soldiers on command. Lily woke up like a prima donna stepping onto the stage, with a clatter, with a flash, with demands. She leapt off the workbench at dawn and began to throw the smithy, clanging, loudly. Then she found Madeline, who was sleeping in the corner on a straw mattress. She hovered over her. Madeline opened her eyes and saw the tip of a stiletto right above her face. She screamed. Lily clanged indignantly and flew over to the window. She lay down dramatically on the windowsill, like a cat that hadn't been paid any attention. Madeline sat on the mattress, breathing heavily. Then she looked at Lily. Then at Dan, who had woken up from the scream and was standing with a hammer at the ready. Then she laughed, hysterically, for a long time, until she cried. Lily on the windowsill flashed happily. From that moment on, Lily became a problem. Not dangerous, exhausting. She would dramatically fall onto her side when Madeline didn't pay attention to her for more than an hour. She would ring insistently when she wanted to be polished. She refused to lie in her scabbard. She refused to lie on the shelf. She demanded that Madeline carry her in her hand, always. Mabel watched this from the shelf and rang out contemptuously, a quiet, grating sound that Dan had learned to interpret as, "God, what a disgrace." Chin and Sun tattled to So-Yeon every time Lily threw another tantrum. They would fly over to So-Yeon and start vibrating, rapidly, indignantly. So-Yeon would sigh and tell them it wasn't her problem. Chin and Sun disagreed. They vibrated even more intensely. So-Yeon rolled her eyes. Dan solved the problem his own way, with a serious face, with an absolutely serious face. He lined up all the blades on the workbench and held the first meeting. Mabel on the left, as the eldest. Chin and Son next to her, shoulder to shoulder, as always. Lily was on the right. She placed her blade dramatically on the edge of the workbench, like a lady resting her elbow on a balcony railing. Dan stood before them, with a hammer in his hand, like the chairman of the council. He said that in this forge they lived by the rules. Duty schedule. Mabel is on duty at night, from midnight until dawn.
Because she's the eldest, and because she likes to fly in the dark. Chin and Son guard the yard. During the day, taking turns, one flies, the other rests. Every 2 hours, a shift change. Lily guards the windows. 2 windows, north and south. If someone approaches, ring quietly. Don't yell. Everyone agrees. Mabel rang. Briefly, businesslike. Chin and Son rang simultaneously, in sync, as always. Lily dramatically fell onto her side. Dan looked at her. He waited. Lily lay there for a second. Then she reluctantly sat up. She rang, capriciously, but she rang. That counted as agreement. So-Yun stood by the door and snorted. Anna stood behind her and laughed, quietly, into her hand. Madeline stood next to Anna and cried and laughed at the same time, because she was standing in a village blacksmith shop, watching a grown man in a leather apron with the utmost seriousness assign duties among flying pieces of metal. And it was the most normal moment of her life in the last 3 years.
Over the course of 3 months, people had gathered around Dan. Anna, the first, quiet, reliable, who brought breakfast every morning and made him eat dinner every evening, who had learned to pump the bellows with perfect rhythm, who knew when Dan needed silence and when he needed conversation, who hadn't asked for anything for herself even once in 3 months. Dan saw this, and every time he saw it, something inside him tightened. Because the knife he had made for her was right, but not enough. A kitchen knife is the answer to the question of what to cut with, not to the question of why to live. So-Yun, the second, tough, disciplined, who trained every morning in the courtyard, who fell asleep with Jin and Soon on either side, who tensed like a bowstring every time Corvin walked by, but no longer reached for her daggers. Progress. Slow, but progress. Madeline, the third, vibrant, chatty, who, in the first week, learned the names of all the villagers,
Who, in the second, translated the scroll with runes on Dan's workbench into 4 languages. Who, in the third, learned to cook porridge. Badly. But she learned. Who wore Lily on her belt and once talked to her as if she were a friend. Told her about the castle. About her father. About the letters. Lily listened. She glowed. Sometimes she rang softly, as if offering comfort. For the first time in her life, Madeline slept peacefully. Every night. No nightmares. Because on the windowsill above her head lay a small stiletto with a lily-shaped guard. And it was guarding her. Corvin. Not a woman. Not part of that strange circle that Dan still refused to call by the word starting with G. Just a man. Quiet. Broken. With the dagger Elena at his belt. He helped. Chopped wood. Repaired the smithy's roof. Carried water. Didn't talk. Didn't complain. Just did what he could. Sometimes in the evenings he sat by the forge and watched the fire. Dan worked nearby. They were silent, the two of them, like 2 blacksmiths at a single forge.
although Corvin had long since stopped forging. 20 years ago, after Elena. Torvald, an old soldier, with a cane and a shield. He became the unofficial commander of Glimmerholm's defenses. He organized patrols. He taught the miller and horse the basics of surveillance. Every evening he reported to Dan who had come, who had gone, what they had seen on the roads. Dan listened, nodded, didn't understand half the military terms, but he listened. Gregor, a second-level blacksmith, who no longer sold Dan's knives, who came to the forge every day and watched Dan work, who asked questions. What is carbon? Why use clay during hardening? Why do you listen to the metal instead of looking at it? Dan explained, patiently. Gregor didn't understand half of it, but he listened, and he tried, and his knives got better. Not like Dan's, but better than before. Dan told him this was just the beginning, and soon Hannah Park arrived, a wandering herbalist, 28 years old, quiet, with eyes in which an old pain lived, so old that it had become part of her face, like a wrinkle, like a scar. She came on foot, with a knapsack on her back. Inside were dried herbs, ointments, tinctures, bandages, everything a healer needs on the road. She stood in the doorway of the smithy and said she'd heard about the blacksmith, that she was a healer, that she needed tools, good ones, not those blunt chisels that local surgeons call scalpels. Dan looked at her hands, small, neat, with slender fingers, hands accustomed to working with the living, with skin, with flesh, with pain. He asked what had happened. Hannah didn't understand. Dan said there was something in her eyes, something old, something heavy. Hannah was silent for a long time. Then she told him, briefly, without tears, her husband, her son, an epidemic, 3 years ago. She couldn't save them. Not one, not the other. She was a doctor, and they died in her arms. Since then, she's been wandering, from village to village, healing, not getting attached, moving on. Because if she gets attached, she'll lose them again, and she wouldn't survive that. Dan listened, then he nodded. He said he would make her some tools, but not now. In 3 days, he needed to think. Hannah shrugged. She could wait. She knew how to wait. Dan thought for 3 days. Then he forged. 2 days. A set of medical instruments. Scalpels, 3 of them, different sizes. Forceps, 2, with a spring mechanism. Tweezers, thin, precise. A suture needle, curved, like a small bird's claw. All small, all suited to her hands. He forged each instrument separately. He spoke to each one, quietly, in English. He told them they would work together, that each of them would know their job. The scalpel finds, the clamp holds, the tweezers extract, the needle closes. A team, small, precise, like a surgical team. After the forging, Dan slept for a day. He gave the set to Hannah in a leather case that Anna had sewn. Hannah opened it, looked, took the scalpel, turned it over. Her hands trembled. She said she had never seen such instruments before. Dan smiled and said, "Wait." The instruments woke up on the 6th day, all at once, like a surgical team on call. Hannah was lying in her room at the inn that Anna had set aside for her, and suddenly the case on the table began to move.
Hannah sat up in bed. The case opened on its own. The instruments rose. All 7 of them. They hovered in the air, lined up in a row, by size, by function. Scalpels in front, clamps on the sides, tweezers in the back. The needle last, as if bringing up the rear. They hung there and waited. Hannah looked at them. They looked at Hannah. If you can say that about pieces of steel without eyes. Then the smallest scalpel flew toward her hand, nuzzled her palm, like a puppy. Hannah closed her hand around it, warm, small, alive.
She pressed it to her chest and sat like that until morning. She didn't cry. She just held it. 3 days later, a woman from a distant village was brought to Glimmerholm. A difficult labor. The baby was in the wrong position. The local midwife couldn't handle it. Hannah took out her kit. Her hands didn't tremble. For the first time in 3 years, her hands didn't tremble. The instruments flew around her. They found. They held. They extracted. They closed. Hannah worked, and they helped, like 6 extra hands. The baby was born alive, healthy. He cried so loud you could hear him in the square. The mother was fine. Hannah stepped outside. She stood there. She looked up at the sky, then at her hands, then at the small scalpel hanging from her shoulder, glimmering softly. She thanked it. The scalpel swayed, like a nod. Hannah stayed in Glimmerholm. She never left again. Then M. Ryder arrived, 17 years old, short, skinny, with dirty red hair and angry green eyes. Her clothes were torn. Her boots were falling apart. On her right arm was an old burn scar. She had walked from a village 2 days' journey away, a village that no longer existed. Wayne's mercenaries had burned it down 6 months ago. No one knew why. Maybe for unpaid taxes, maybe just because they could. M's parents had died. She had survived. She hid in the forest. Then she walked. Then she heard about the blacksmith. She stood before Dan and said she wanted to learn how to forge weapons. Dan asked why. M answered honestly. To take revenge. For her mom. For her dad. For the village. For everyone. Dan looked at her angry green eyes, at the scar on her arm, at her clenched fists. He'd seen it before, 1,000 times, in the mirror. When he was 17 and his father died and the workshop stood empty, and Dan didn't know what to do with hands that knew only how to forge and with a rage that had nowhere to go. Dan sat M down at the anvil. He handed her a hammer, a small one, a light one, just right for her hand. He placed a piece of iron in front of her and told her to forge a horseshoe for the old miller's blind horse. M looked at him. She had come to forge swords, not horseshoes. Dan repeated, "A horseshoe." M was angry. She cursed through clenched teeth, with the dirty words she'd learned over 6 months in the forest. She struck the anvil crookedly with the hammer. The horseshoe came out crooked, skewed, with jagged edges. Dan took it, threw it back into the forge. He explained it again. M forged it again. Worse,
because she was angrier. Dan took it, explained it again. 7 times. 7 horseshoes, all crooked. Em was red with rage. Her hands were burning, her shoulders ached, sweat on her forehead, tears in her eyes that she would never let fall. On the 8th time, she stopped, exhaled, closed her eyes, raised the hammer, and struck. Not with anger, with precision. 1 strike, a turn, a strike, a pull back, a strike. She wasn't thinking about revenge.
She wasn't thinking about her parents. She wasn't thinking about anything. She was just forging. The horseshoe turned out well, even, precise, with the right curve. Dan took it, looked at it, nodded. They went to the mill. Em carried the horseshoe. Dan walked beside her. The horse stood in the stall, old, blind, with cataracts in both eyes. The miller held its reins. Dan shoed the horse, showed Em how, put the horseshoe on, hammered in the nails. Then the miller led the horse out into the yard, let go of the reins. The horse stood there. Then it took a step. Then another. Then it walked down the road, confidently, straight, without stumbling, as if it could see. Not with its eyes, with its horseshoes. The horse reached the mill, stopped at the door, snorted, as if to say, "Finally." Em watched as the blind horse walked down the road, confidently and straight ahead, and she laughed. For the first time in 2 years, not out of joy, out of surprise. Because her hands, which she had been preparing for revenge, had just helped a blind horse find its way home. Dan stood nearby and said nothing. He didn't need to. The horseshoe had said it all for him. Then Sarah Lindquist arrived, the last one. 31 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with short, light hair, with a face that told everything there was to know about her life. A scar across her right eyebrow, a broken nose, thin lips pressed into a line, and her eyes, gray, dull, empty. The eyes of a person who had stopped waiting. Former captain of the Capitol City Guard, 10 years of service, 3 wounds, 2 promotions, 1 recommendation for a medal. Then the 4th wound, a mace to the right knee. The bone shattered. The surgeons pieced together what they could. What they couldn't, they cut off. The shin bone had fused at an angle. The knee was gone. They discharged her, with a letter of appreciation, with a small pension, and with a wish for good luck. Like worn-out material. Sarah limped, with a cane that was worse than Torvald's stick, a stick made of green wood, crooked, creaky, with a handle wrapped in rags. She limped and drank for 3 years, every day, from morning till night, until she fell. Then she got up and drank again. She came because Torvald found her in a ditch by the road halfway to Glimmerholm. He told her about the blacksmith. She didn't believe him, but she went. Because it was cold and wet in the ditch, and in the village there was at least a roof. Dan examined her leg, silently, for a long time. Soyeon stood nearby and watched. Hannah stood on the other side. Her instruments flew around Serena's leg, scanning, buzzing,
A small scalpel poked into the spot where the bone had fused crookedly and hummed quietly. Hannah said the bone was broken in 3 places. It had healed incorrectly. The nerves were damaged. The muscles had atrophied. Conventional medicine couldn't fix it. Dan nodded.
He wasn't going to fix it. He was going to replace it. He forged it for 3 days. A steel prosthesis, a shin made of strips of forged iron twisted torsionally like Torvald's cane. The same principle. The twisted metal fibers work like a rope, flexible and strong at the same time, lightweight, stronger than bone, with a hinge instead of a knee. Dan made the hinge with particular care. 2 out of the 3 days were spent on the hinge, because a knee isn't just a hinge. A knee is a highly complex mechanism. Flexion, extension, rotation, shock absorption. Dan couldn't replicate everything, but he could get close. He made a double hinge with a spring made of hardened steel. Not perfect, but it works. And a little secret, a retractable blade in the foot. 15 centimeters of sharpened steel, hidden in the sole. It extends with a specific movement of the ankle, not for attack, for confidence. So the old captain knows she's still armed. Always. Even barefoot. Sarah put on the prosthesis. Dan helped. He adjusted the fasteners, tightened the straps. He checked the fit. Sarah sat on the bench and looked at her new leg. Steel. Shiny. With a fine torsion pattern across the surface. Then she stood up. Slowly. Carefully. She grabbed the edge of the workbench. She shifted her weight. The prosthesis held. The joint bent and straightened, smoothly, without a creak. Sarah took a step. Steady. Then a second. Then she let go of the workbench. She stood on her own. Without a cane. Without support. Without anything. Then she walked across the yard, 20 steps, straight ahead. Then she turned around. She looked at So Young, who was practicing with a cane against the wall, and knocked the cane out of her hand with a kick from her prosthetic leg. Quick, precise, professional. So Young raised her eyebrows. Then she looked at Sarah. Then at her steel leg. Then she smiled. She was the first to extend her hand. Sarah shook it, firmly, briefly, like someone who had found herself. Dan stood in the doorway of the smithy and watched. Surrounding him were 6 women, each of whom had come bearing her own pain. Anna, who had run the tavern alone for 7 years. So Jan, who had killed on command for 12 years. Madeline, who had been sold like livestock. Hannah, who had lost her family and was afraid to form attachments. M, who lived only for revenge. Sarah, who had stopped living altogether. And to each of them, he gave not a weapon, but an answer. A kitchen knife for the one who had forgotten how to desire. Daggers for the one who had forgotten how to choose. A stiletto for the one who had forgotten her mother's scent. Tools for the one who was afraid to heal. A horseshoe for the one who wanted only to destroy. A prosthesis for the one who considered herself broken. Mabel sat on his shoulder and chimed softly. Enough. Like a mother watching her large family at dinner. That evening, Dan held his first full gathering of blades. All of them. On the workbench. In a row. Mabel on the left, small, slender, first, the main one. She knew it, and everyone else knew it. Chin and Son next to her, shoulder to shoulder, as always. Lily further away.
carefully avoiding Chin and Sun because they didn't like her. The feeling was mutual. Hannah's medical kit. 7 small instruments lined up in a row, as if on parade. And his sword, which still hadn't awakened, but it hummed every night, louder and louder, warmer and warmer. Dan placed it last, on the right, at the edge, like a rookie in formation who hadn't yet earned a spot in the center. Dan stood before them. So-Yun stood by the door, Anna behind her. Madeline sat on the bench, hugging her knees. Hannah stood by the window. Em sat on the floor with her legs crossed. Sarah stood upright, on both feet, one made of steel. Dan looked at the blades, at the people, and said one word. Family. Mabel rang out first, like an older sister who always answers first.
A high, clear note from a scalpel. Then Chin and Sun. 2 notes in unison. A third. Harmonious. Precise. Just like themselves. Then Lily, a capricious note, with vibrato, but clear. Then Hannah's ensemble, a scattering of thin voices, like a handful of silver coins tossed onto a table. Then the sword, a quiet, low hum, not yet a voice, but no longer silence. They arrived at dawn, all at once, as if someone had pulled 3 strings simultaneously. From the south, along the main road, came the gray cloaks of Vane's mercenaries. Dan stood on the hill next to Torvald and counted. 200, maybe more. The columns stretched a quarter of a league. Cavalry in front, infantry behind them. Behind the infantry, the supply train. This was serious. Not a raid. An army. From the west, along the path through the forest, came the white cloaks of the Order of Holy Steel. 24, with swords and torches. The torches burned at dawn. Unnecessary. Symbolic. We came to burn. Something else came from the east. Something that made the air 3 degrees colder in 10 minutes. The grass beneath their feet turned black. The dew froze. The gray horde. The first reconnaissance unit. 12 figures. Tall. 2 heads taller than a man. Shapeless. With skin the color of ash and wet stone. Unarmed. They don't need weapons. They are weapons themselves. 3 armies approached Glimmerholm at the same time, from 3 sides, as if they had agreed, or as if something had called them all to a single point. Dan thought it was a coincidence. Corvin said it wasn't. Not a coincidence. An attraction. Living steel resonates, like a beacon. The more living blades in one place, the stronger the signal. 40 blades in a single village is a signal that can be heard for hundreds of leagues. By everyone. By humans. By non-humans. By anything seeking power. Dan stood in the blacksmith's yard, barefoot, in his work apron, with a hammer in his right hand. He hadn't put on his boots. Not because he'd forgotten, because his feet on the cold ground could feel the vibration. 200 pairs of boots. That's a lot of vibration. The sword hung at his belt, cold, silent, still not awake. Dan placed his hand on the hilt. Nothing. Warmth. A quiet hum, but not awakening. Not yet. 6 people stood behind him. Anna with a kitchen knife in her right hand. The knife glimmered softly, with the warm light of home. Anna held it firmly, confidently.
just as she held it every day while chopping onions. So-Yun, with Chin and Sun in her hands, the daggers vibrated, quickly, impatiently. They wanted to work. So-Yun breathed evenly, deeply, like before a battle. She knew what battle was, better than anyone here. Madeline, with Lily in her palm, the stiletto glinted nervously. Madeline was pale, but stood straight, chin up, a habit of the Duke's daughter. Hannah, with a medical kit in the bag on her belt, the instruments jingled quietly inside. Ready. Hannah wasn't a warrior,
but she knew that after the battle, a healer would be needed, and she would be here. M with the hammer Dan had made for her to train with. Light, precise. Not a weapon, a tool. But in a blacksmith's hands, a hammer is a hammer. Sarah with her prosthetic and Torvald's shield, which the old soldier had given her because her grip was stronger. She stood steady. On both legs. The left one of bone and muscle, the right one of forged iron. Both stood firm. Torvald stood nearby with his cane, not behind Dan, beside him, like a soldier in formation. 22 years on the front lines, 4 wounds, 3 wars. He knew his place. Corvin stood a little further back, Elena's dagger in his hand, his face calm, his eyes empty. Not dead, empty. Like a man who has made a choice and is no longer afraid, because there is nothing left to fear. Mabel hung by Dan's temple and rang, continuously, on a single note, high, clear, like a tuning fork. She didn't fly, didn't circle, just hung there and rang. Like a lighthouse, like a signal. I'm here. We are here. Rain stepped forward from the line of mercenaries, alone, unarmed, a sword at his belt. His face was calm and professional, just like last time, just like the time before that. He looked at Dan, at the 6 women behind him, at the flying scalpel, at the daggers in So-Yun's hands, at the stiletto in Madeline's palm, at Sarah's steel leg, at the old soldier with a cane, at the former inquisitor with a dagger. Rain said the Duke was making his final offer. Come willingly, or things would get ugly. His voice was even. No threat, no emotion, a statement of fact. He didn't want a fight. He was a professional. Professionals don't want a fight. Professionals want results. From the other side emerged the commander of the Order's detachment. Young, 25, maybe younger. Fanatical eyes. Burning. Like the torches his men carried. He was shouting, his voice cracked. The blacksmith must surrender his demons! Living weapons are heresy. The crossed anvil tolerates no blasphemy. The Order will purge this land with fire. Holy steel knows no mercy. He shouted, and his men stood behind him. Some believed him, some did not, but all held their swords. Corvin stepped forward. 1 step, past Dan, past So-Yun, into the open space between the forge and the 3 armies. He raised the dagger to Elena. It glowed, a quiet white light. Not bright, not blinding, warm, like a candle in the window of a house where someone is waiting for you. Corvin said one thing to the young commander, quietly, calmly, without fanfare.
He said that for 20 years he had worn a white cloak. For 20 years he had believed that living steel was a curse. For 20 years he broke blades and killed blacksmiths. And he was wrong. All 20 years, every day, every hour, every broken blade, every slain master. Wrong. The curse is not the steel. The curse is the fear forged into the steel. He knows.
He forged fear into his blade, and the blade became what it was made to be. Fear, jealousy, death. But love forged into steel is not a curse. It is a blessing. He knows, because a blacksmith named Dan reforged his broken blade, and he did not imbue it with fear, memory, warmth, forgiveness, and the blade became what it was made to be, a blessing. The young commander looked at him and did not understand. He saw a legend before him. Sir Corvin Ashe, the hammer of the order, the one who had broken more living blades than anyone else in 300 years. And this man stood before him with a living dagger in his hand and said he was wrong. The young commander did not understand, but some of his men lowered their swords. Not all, but some. Those who were older, those who remembered Corvin not from stories, but from service. The gray horde did not speak. 12 figures stood in silence, motionless, like stones. A chill emanated from them, and a smell. Damp. Dead. Like iron that had lain in water too long.
Rust. Decay. Decomposition. Dan looked at them and felt something. Not fear, recognition. As if he had seen this before. As if this cold and this smell were part of something he knew but couldn't remember. Something on the edge of memory. Something from another life. From the workshop in Allentown. The smell of old iron. The smell of rust. The smell of metal that had died. Mabel shuddered on his shoulder, not from fear, from something else, from recognition. She felt it too. A small scalpel made of a horseshoe and a nail. She knew that smell, the smell of dead metal, the opposite of what she was. She was living steel. They were dead. And standing between those two poles was Dan. Dan placed his hand on the hilt of the sword, silent, cold, dead, which hummed every night but never woke, which was warm in his hand but not alive, which was waiting for something Dan couldn't give, or didn't want to, or was afraid of.
And suddenly, Dan understood. Standing barefoot in the blacksmith's yard between 3 armies, he understood why the sword hadn't awakened. He had forged it for protection, for the village, for the people. But that was a lie. Not a complete lie, a half-truth, worse than a lie. He was forging it out of fear. Out of the same fear that Corvin had once instilled in his Elena, fear of losing, fear of not making it in time, fear that they would come and take it away, fear that he wasn't enough, that his hands wouldn't be enough, that his knowledge wouldn't be enough, that he was just one small blacksmith from Pennsylvania and couldn't protect an entire village from the Duke and the Order and the Horde.
And the sword sensed that, because the sword was made of him, of his soul, from that piece that Dan had given up while forging it, and that piece was steeped in fear. That's why the sword was silent. That's why it wouldn't awaken. Because Dan hadn't put himself into it. He'd put his fear.
And fear isn't an answer. Fear is a question without an answer. Dan took the sword from his belt. Slowly, everyone was watching. Rain, the mercenaries, the order, the horde, his men behind him, everyone. Dan laid the sword on the ground, in front of him, on the cold morning grass. The blade glinted in the first rays of the sun. Then Dan raised the hammer and struck the anvil standing in the blacksmith's yard. That very one. The cracked one. The one he'd started with on the first day. The clang echoed across the field, clear, loud, like a bell, like a heartbeat. One. Everyone froze. The mercenaries, the order, the horde, everyone. Dan struck again. And again. He was forging. Not a sword, not a knife, not a horseshoe, nothing. He was simply striking the anvil with his hammer, rhythmically, steadily, like a heartbeat. A blow, a second, a blow, a second, a blow. And with every blow, the ringing grew louder, because with every blow, the blades around him answered. Mabe was first, the high, thin note of the scalpel, clear as glass. She responded to the very first blow, like an older sister who always answers first. Then Chin and Sun, two notes in unison. A third, synchronized, as always. Then Lily, a capricious note, with vibrato, with character, but pure. Then Hannah's medical kit, a scattering of thin voices, 7 notes, 7 instruments, each at its own pitch. Then Eilen's dagger in Corvin's hand, a quiet white ring, gentle, like the voice of a woman who forgives. Then the horseshoe of a blind horse from somewhere near the mill, a low hum of iron on a hoof, distant but distinct. Then Torvald's cane, the hum of an old spear. Torvald shuddered. He looked at his cane. It vibrated in his hand and responded. Then Anna's kitchen knife, a warm, homely sound like the clatter of dishes at breakfast. Anna gripped the handle and a shiver ran down her arms. The knife spoke, for the first time. Then Owen's small knife, from somewhere in the village, a child's voice. High-pitched, clear, the sound of wood shavings under the blade. Dan struck with the hammer, and every blade he had ever made in this world responded, one by one, in turn, calling out its name. Mabel, Chin, Sun, Lily, Elena, Dad, and others, those whose names Dan didn't say out loud. Bracers for the old weaver, shears for the girl who sheared sheep, an axle for a millstone, bolts for the tavern, hinges for doors. Every name is a story. Every story is a person. Every person is a life he has heard,
to whom he said, "I hear you. Come, tell me. Show me your hands. Show me your pain, and I will make the answer." The ringing grew louder. 40 voices, all the blades he had made over these months, knives, scalpels, horseshoes, cuffs, bolts, hinges, everything that had passed through his hands and into which he had poured even a drop of himself, even a single blow of the hammer with the thought of a specific person. Everything responded. Everything rang out. Everything sang.
In 40 different notes, and together it sounded like a cathedral bell. No, not a bell. A choir. A choir of voices that had never sung together, each on its own, each in its place. In the smithy, in the tavern, on a belt, in a bag, on the hoof of a blind horse, on a rope around a little boy's neck, and all together at the signal of a single hammer on a single old, cracked anvil. Rain took a step back, involuntarily. His mercenaries exchanged glances. They were professionals. They had seen magic. They had seen high-level blacksmiths. They had seen blades that burned and blades that froze and blades that cleaved stone. But they had never seen 40 blades that sang by name. This was different. Not power, not magic. Something human. Something that made your throat tighten. The young commander of the order turned pale. His torch trembled in his hand. He heard a ringing. And in that ringing there was no heresy. There was no curse in it. There was warmth in it. The same warmth as in the prayer he recited every morning. Only real. Corvin was on his knees. He didn't remember how he had fallen. He just knelt there and wept. Elena glowed brighter in his hand, brighter than ever, with a warm, white light. And Corvin felt a touch on his cheek, light, like a palm, just like 20 years ago. So-Yeon stood upright, with daggers in her hands, with Chin and Sun singing in unison, and a smile never left her face. Not a battle smile, not a harsh one, a real one, a gentle one. The smile of a person who finally knows what her hands are for. Anna held her knife, a kitchen knife, warm, singing. And she looked at Dan, only at Dan, just as she had looked at him every day, silently, without words, without demands. She simply looked. And in her eyes was everything she hadn't said for 3 months. The gray horde wavered. 12 figures stepped back for the first time. The cold around them receded, like darkness before dawn. The ringing of living metal was what they feared. Not steel, not weapons, not magic. Life in steel. Intentions, care, love hammered into every molecule. They were dead metal, rust, decay. And this was living metal, warm, singing, remembering. 2 opposites, and one of them was retreating. Dan lowered the hammer. Silence, absolute, as if the world had held its breath. 40 blades froze in the air, on shelves, at their belts, on their hooves. They froze and waited. Then Dan bent down and picked up the sword from the ground. Slowly, he took it in his hand, gripped the hilt, and the sword awoke. Not quietly,
not gradually, not like Mabel, who opened her eyes and looked around, not like Chin and Sun, who stood at attention, not like Lily, who made a scene. All at once, like a man who had waited his whole life, who had heard every ring, every name, every story, who had absorbed them into himself every night as the forge hummed in the darkness, and finally heard his name. Not spoken.
Understood. The sword hummed so loudly that the ground beneath his feet shook. A bass note, deep, like the foundation of a house, like the roots of a tree. Then it rose from Dan's hand, slowly, majestically. It hovered in the air above his head, and all 40 blades around him sang along with it, simultaneously, on a single note, on his note, like a family picking up a melody. And Dan understood. He understood that he hadn't forged this sword for himself, nor out of fear, nor for the village. He had forged it for all of them, for every name that had been spoken, for Mabel and Chin and Sun and Lily and Elena and Dad, and for the 40 other voices. The sword was not a weapon, not a defense, not a symbol. The sword was a connection, a thread, the center of a web, the point where all the lines converged, between him and everyone to whom he had ever said, "I hear you." Dan reached out. The sword settled back into his palm, warm, alive, singing, heavy. Not from its weight, From the responsibility, from the 40 names that now resonated within it. Dan gripped the hilt and felt each one of them. Mabel, who sang and smelled of flower. Torvald, who had stood in the ranks for 22 years. Owen, who had lost his father. Anna, who silently placed a second plate. Each one. All of them. Together. Dan looked at Rain, then at the order, then at the gray horde. He spoke softly, but his voice echoed across the entire field, because every blade around him amplified the sound. Each became a resonator. Each carried the vibration further, and the quiet voice of one man sounded like the voice of 40. He said they weren't demons. They were people to whom he had once said, "I hear you." Rain looked at him, for a long time, at the barefoot blacksmith in an apron, at the 6 women behind him, at the 40 blades circling in the air, slowly and quietly, singing, at the sword in his hand. Rain was a professional. He had fought for 20 years. He had seen armies. He had seen mages. He had seen death. But he had never seen this. He didn't know what to call it. But he knew one thing. His 200 mercenaries would not go through this. Not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't want to. Because each of them had heard their own name in that ringing. Each had remembered someone. A mother, a wife, a daughter, a son. Someone to whom they had once said, "I hear you," and forgotten. Rain turned to his men. He looked at the 200 faces. He saw what he expected. He said one word. "Let's go." 200 mercenaries turned and left, silently, without a single blow, without a single word. The column retreated back onto the road,
and vanished into the morning mist. The young commander of the order stood and looked at Corvin, at the legend, at the hammer of the order, at the man he had wanted to emulate his whole life. And this man was kneeling with a live dagger in his hand, and he was crying and smiling.
The young commander looked at the dagger, Elena, at the quiet white light, at the tears on Corvin's face, and something inside him cracked. Not faith, not conviction, a wall. That wall the order had built in every novice from the age of 12, the wall between the heart and steel. It cracked. It didn't collapse, it cracked. That was enough. The young commander lowered his sword. He looked at his torch. He blew it out. He turned and led his men away, silently, like rain, without words. The gray horde retreated last. 12 figures stood motionless for a long time, longer than anyone else. They were not afraid of people, not afraid of swords, not afraid of fire, but the ringing of living metal penetrated them, like heat penetrates ice, slowly, inevitable, and the ice melted. The 12 figures took a step back, one step, another step, another. Then they dissolved into the morning mist, departing. For the first time in 300 years, the gray horde retreated. Not from an army, Not from magic, not from strength, from the ringing of 40 blades in which a human soul lived. The field was empty. Glimmerholm stood, whole, unharmed. Not a single broken fence, not a single broken down door, not a single drop of blood. A village defended not by the sword, but by a name. Dan lowered his sword, heavily. His hands trembled, not from fear, from emptiness, from the fact that he had just given away another piece of himself, a big one, bigger than all the previous ones. He asked the sword quietly, "What is your name?" The sword hummed. One word, one name, which Dan had known since the moment it was forged, but was afraid to say, because that name was too big, too important, too real. Glimmerholm. The sword had named itself after the village, after home. Not his home, their home. Everyone's. Dan stood in the blacksmith's yard, barefoot, in his work apron, with a sword named Glimmerholm in his hand. The sun was rising. Morning light flooded the village, golden, warm, like horn. Anna stood beside him. Her hand rested on his shoulder, heavy, warm, as always. So Young stood behind him. Chin and sun circled slowly above her head, tired, but they didn't land. Duty is duty. Madeline was crying and laughing at the same time, just like back then at the first gathering of blades. Lily circled around her, comforting her, in her own way, capriciously, but tenderly. Hannah checked everyone for injuries they didn't have, a professional habit. Her tools flew nearby and helped. They scanned, they hummed, they found.
They found nothing. Hannah smiled. Em sat on the ground and stared at the sky with her mouth open. It was the first time she'd seen 40 blades sing together. It was the first time she understood why horseshoes were forged. Sarah stood upright, for the first time in years, without leaning on anything, not on a cane, not on a wall, not on a bottle. On both legs, one of bone, one of steel, both hers. Torvald stood with his cane and wept, quietly.
Like an old man, with sparse, short tears, like a man who had stood in the ranks for 22 years and hadn't cried once in 3 wars. And now he was crying, because he had seen what he hadn't hoped to see, that it was possible to win a battle without spilling a single drop of blood. Corvin sat on the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him. Elena lay in his palms. She glowed, softly, warmly, and Corvin smiled. For the first time in 20 years, not bitterly, not forced, genuinely, like a man who had received what he hadn't asked for, forgiveness. Mabel perched on Dan's shoulder, tired, a small scalpel made from a horseshoe and a nail, Dan's first living blade. She flew higher, longer than anyone else. It rang louder than anyone else. It defended more fiercely than anyone else. It clinked softly, on a note Dan already knew by heart, on a note he'd heard every day since his 3rd day in this world. It was a note that spoke. You haven't finished the knife for Mrs. Kowalski. Let's go home. Once we've sorted things out here. Dan smiled. He looked at the village, at the smithy with its cracked anvil and the fire that hadn't gone out in 3 months, at the tavern with the bolts he'd forged from nails, at the people around him. 6 women, each of whom had come with her own pain and left with her own answer. An old soldier who stands upright again, a former inquisitor who knows how to cry again, a second-tier blacksmith learning to listen to metal, a boy with a knife on a string who carves his father's face, a girl whose mother sings again in the mornings, a blind horse that finds its way home. At the blades in the air. 40, each with its own name, each with a piece of his soul. And Dan said quietly, I'm home now. Mabel was silent, for a second, 2. Then she jingled again, softly, in agreement, as if she understood too. A small scalpel made of a horseshoe and a nail, the first living thing, the first friend. She lay down on his shoulder and fell silent, warm. The fire in the forge was still burning. The coals smoldered evenly and warmly. A red light, like a heart. Dan looked at them, then at the hammer in his hand, then at Anna, who was standing nearby and smiling, quietly, without words, just as she smiled every day, when she set down a second plate, when she pumped the bellows, when she silently placed her hand on his shoulder. He said he had orders for the next 3 weeks, and that the coal was running out, and that he needed help with the bellows because Gregor was pumping too fast, and Torvald had asked to have the miller's second horse shoed, and the weaver from the neighboring village had sent a letter saying the arm guards needed tightening, and Owen wanted a new piece of linden wood because the old one was finished,
and Lily is refusing to stay in the scabbard again, so we need to hold another meeting of the blades and explain the rules to her." Anna nodded. She said breakfast would be in an hour. Porridge with bread.
"Don't be late, because the last time he was late, Mabel ate his portion. She didn't eat it, of course. A scalpel doesn't eat porridge. But she stuck herself in the plate and wouldn't let anyone near it. On principle." Dan walked into the smithy. He took off his sword. He leaned it against the wall. Carefully, just like a child is placed in a crib, next to the wooden horse on the shelf. The Glimmerholm sword and Owen's horse, side by side, big and small, strength and memory, together. Mabel lay down in her nest of rags, tired, curled up, fell silent, a small scalpel sleeping in its nest. Dan would shake his head every time he looked at it, and every time he smiled. Chin and Son stood guard by the door, shoulder to shoulder, as always, on duty. Lily settled on the windowsill, picture perfect, like a lady on a balcony. Hannah's kit went back into the bag, organized, in order. Scalpels first, clamps second, the needle last, as always. Dan put on his apron. He picked up the hammer, his own. The one he'd made during his first month. 800 grams. The head slightly rounded. An ash wood handle, 32 centimeters. The hammer fit his hand like an extension of his arm, like a finger, like a thought. Dan walked over to the forge. He placed his hand on the bellows. The coals were waiting, red, warm, alive, like everything in this smithy.